behind the gilded gates of the world's most heavily guarded sanctuary, lies a 2,000-year trail of blood, blackmail, and absolute silence. You've been told it's a place of holy devotion, but what if the ultimate empire of secrets is actually a sovereign playground for the untouchable? From a rotting papal corpse put on trial, to mafia blood money hidden in sacred vaults, and a terrifying ghost network of missing children, this is the information they forbade the world from seeing. Across these chapters, we are crossing the border into a legal black hole where accountability completely ceases to exist. Turn off the lights, plug in your headphones, and listen closely, because once you step inside these vaults, there is absolutely no turning back. Chapter 1. The Cadaver Synod. Putting a dead pope on trial. The year is 897 AD. The setting, the Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome. It is a place of immense sanctity, usually filled with the smell of incense and the hushed whispers of pilgrims. But today the air is thick with a different scent. It is the heavy, cloying, unmistakable stench of decay. Imagine you are a witness in this room. You look toward the papal throne. Sitting there, slumped in a chair, is a body. It has been dead for 9 months. It is Pope Formosus. He is dressed in full, magnificent papal vestments, stiff, expensive silk and gold embroidery that clashes violently with the greyish, withered skin and the sight of bones pushing against the fabric. His jaw is slack, his eyes are empty, and his hands, which once held the power to excommunicate kings, now lie limply in his lap. This is not a funeral. This is a courtroom. And this is the Cadaver Synod. History is written by the victors, but sometimes the victors are so consumed by hatred that they drag the past out of the grave just to punish it. Pope Stephen VI, the man who ordered this, sits on a throne nearby. He is seething. He isn't just seeking justice, he is seeking an exorcism of his predecessor's legacy. He wants Formosus erased. The trial begins. It is an exercise in absolute madness. A young deacon is forced to stand behind the rotting corpse. His job? He is to act as the voice for the dead pope. As Stephen stands and screams accusations at the cadaver, demanding to know why Formosus, a man who had no right to the throne, had the audacity to become pope, the deacon trembles. He is forced to shout out pathetic, terrified defenses on behalf of the corpse. "Why did you leave your bishopric?" Stephen bellows. The room is dead silent. The deacon, sweating, manages a weak response. It is a theatre of the grotesque. The judges are terrified, the congregation is horrified, and the corpse remains silent, staring blankly at nothing. But Pope Stephen doesn't care about the legalities. He wants blood. He wants to strip Formosus of every shred of holiness. The verdict comes down, guilty. The punishment is as brutal as the trial was absurd. They strip the papal vestments from the corpse, tearing the clothes away from the putrefying skin. They cut off the 3 fingers of the right hand, the fingers Formosus used to give the papal blessing, as if they could somehow sever his connection to God. Then they drag the body through the muddy cobblestone streets of Rome, while the mob jeers and throws stones. Finally, they dump the remains of the Vicar of Christ into the Tiber River, like common trash. But here is where the story turns from a dark history lesson into something much stranger. The people of Rome, who initially watched with a mix of fear and curiosity, soon turned. Seeing the church descend into this level of depravity shook the foundation of the city. Rumors began to spread like wildfire. They said the river washed the body up on the banks, and that it began to perform miracles. They said the corpse, even in its broken state, was healing the sick. Whether true or not, the public perception shifted violently. Pope Stephen VI had tried to destroy Formosus, but in doing so he had only destroyed himself. The backlash was swift and bloody. Just months after the trial, a mob of furious Romans rose up. They didn't drag Stephen to court. They didn't hold a trial. They simply threw him into a dungeon and strangled him to death. So, why did they do it? Why dig up a man and put him on trial? It wasn't just a petty grudge. Formosus held secrets, political and ecclesiastical, that threatened to dismantle the power structures of the era. By putting him on trial, Stephen wasn't just attacking a person. He was attempting to delegitimize every decision Formosus had ever made, potentially invalidating everything the church had done during his reign. It was a scorched earth policy, literal and figurative. The Cadaver Synod remains one of the darkest, most embarrassing chapters in the long, convoluted history of the Vatican. It is a chilling reminder that beneath the gilded cathedrals and the holy titles, the church has been a stage for the most primal, ruthless human impulses. We often look at the Vatican as an unchanging monolith, a place where time stands still, but the story of the Cadaver Synod tells us something different. It tells us that power, when left unchecked and driven by blind vengeance, can lead to places so dark, so irrational, and so truly terrifying that even death provides no sanctuary. And you have to wonder, in those centuries of locked archives and secret rituals, how many other trials have taken place that we will simply never hear about? Chapter 2. Father Gabriele Mayworth's 60,000 exorcisms. Let's look closely at a number that, frankly, shouldn't make any statistical sense. 60,000. If you sit down with a calculator and break that down across a career spanning roughly 30 years, the math forces you into a very uncomfortable corner. It means this man was confronting what he believed to be the literal biblical manifestation of evil, multiple times a day, every single day, without a break. While most people spend their mornings commuting or drinking coffee, his schedule was booked solid with hell. This wasn't a Hollywood movie set. There were no special effects, no dramatic lighting, and no scripting. This was the daily reality of Father Gabriele Amorth, the real-life chief exorcist of the Vatican. But if you're picturing a grim, shadow-dwelling figure clutching a wooden crucifix with trembling hands, you're completely mistaken. Amorth was something far more fascinating and far more unsettling. Before he ever donned the black cassock of an exorcist, he was a member of the Italian resistance in World War II, fighting fascists in the mountains. He was a trained lawyer, a journalist, and a man known for a dry, razor-sharp wit. He didn't look like a horror movie protagonist. He looked like a kindly, balding Italian grandfather who enjoyed a good joke. He famously claimed that the devil absolutely hated it when you made fun of him because pride is the root of all evil. Yet, this rational, deeply grounded man spent decades operating in the darkest corners of human experience. When Amorth was appointed as an exorcist for the Diocese of Rome in 1986, he didn't dive in blindly. He was a staunch rationalist first. He openly admitted that out of every 100 people who walked through his door claiming to be possessed, 99 of them didn't need a priest. They needed a psychiatrist. He worked hand in hand with medical professionals, checking boxes for schizophrenia, hysteria, and epilepsy. He wanted to find a medical explanation. He prayed to find a medical explanation. But it's that remaining 1%, the anomalies that science couldn't touch, where the story takes a terrifying turn. Father Amorth's case notes read like a catalogue of absolute psychological and physical dread. He documented instances that defied every known law of physics. He described a young boy who, while completely unconscious, levitated several feet into the air, hovering above his bed as terrified family members watched. He wrote about a petite, mild-mannered woman who had to be restrained by 6 burly men, displaying a terrifying explosive physical strength that her muscle mass simply could not possess. Even more jarring was the auditory distortion. Father Amorth recounted victims who would open their mouths and speak in deep, guttural, multitonal voices, as if 3 or 4 distinct entities were speaking through the exact same vocal cords simultaneously. They would hiss insults in ancient dead languages like Aramaic, Latin, and ancient Greek, languages the possessed individuals had never learned or even heard in their entire lives. But perhaps the most grotesque phenomenon Amorth witnessed was what he called demonic materialization. During the peak of a violent deliverance ritual, possessed individuals would frequently begin to gag and choke. They weren't just throwing up bile. Amorth claimed that they would physically spit out solid objects. He kept a large glass-fronted cabinet in his office that looked like a museum of nightmares. It was filled entirely with items he had personally watched people regurgitate: heavy, rusty iron nails, jagged shards of glass, ancient metal keys, braided locks of hair, and even small broken plastic toys. Medical examiners who looked at the objects were baffled. There was no internal tearing, no bleeding in the esophagus, and no biological explanation for how these items had entered or exited the body. For decades, the Vatican allowed Amorth to operate in the suburbs of Rome, acting as a shield between the ordinary world and the inexplicable. But as the years went on, Amorth's focus shifted from isolated bedrooms to the very heart of the institution he served. In 2010, Amorth released a statement that sent massive shockwaves through the global Catholic Church. He didn't just say the devil was real. He looked directly at the camera and declared that Satan had successfully infiltrated the highest corridors of power inside the Vatican itself. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. Amorth pointed to the devastating wave of hidden sex abuse scandals, systemic financial corruption within the Vatican Bank, and bitter internal power struggles among the cardinals as direct physical evidence of demonic corruption. He recalled the famous words of Pope Paul VI from 1972 that the smoke of Satan has entered the temple of God, and warned that the smoke had now become a choking fog. According to the Vatican's top spiritual warrior, the enemy wasn't knocking at the gates. The enemy was already sitting in the sanctuary, pulling the strings. Father Amorth passed away in 2016 at the age of 91. Right up until his final breaths, he maintained that he was never afraid of the dark, stating that the devil is ultimately a coward when confronted with pure faith. But he left behind a chilling legacy. He showed the world that when you peer into the abyss of the Vatican's mysteries, the most terrifying threats aren't the ones hiding in the shadows outside the walls. They are the ones currently making themselves at home inside the Holy See. Chapter 3. The Disappearance of Emanuela Orlandi. On June 22nd, 1983, Rome was trapped in the grip of a suffocating summer heatwave. 15-year-old Emanuela Orlandi left her family's apartment for a routine flute lesson. Her life was, by all accounts, completely ordinary, except for one unique detail. Her home was located inside the walls of Vatican City. Her father was a deeply trusted clerk within the prefecture of the pontifical household, making Emanuela one of the few citizens of the world's smallest, most secretive sovereign state. After her lesson, Emanuela stepped out onto the hot Roman concrete and made a phone call to her sister from a public payphone. She sounded anxious. She mentioned that a strange man in a dark green BMW had just approached her, offering her a staggering amount of money to distribute promotional flyers for Avon Cosmetics. Her sister told her to be careful, to come straight home. Emanuela hung up the phone, walked toward a bus stop, and vanished off the face of the earth. What followed is a cold case rabbit hole, so deep, so profoundly unsettling, that it shifted almost overnight from a local missing persons case into a terrifying labyrinth of international espionage, organized crime, and a multi-decade institutional cover-up. A few days after she disappeared, the Orlandi family phone began to ring. The callers didn't sound like typical panicked kidnappers. They spoke with cold, chillingly precise, bureaucratic authority. One recurring caller, dubbed the American by the media due to his distinct accent, made a demand that baffled investigators worldwide. He didn't want money. He demanded that the Vatican secure the immediate release of Mehmet Ali Agca, the Turkish ultra-nationalist assassin who had shot and nearly killed Pope John Paul II in St. Peter's Square 2 years prior. It was a completely surreal proposition. Why would an international terrorist network care about an ordinary 15-year-old schoolgirl? How could her life possibly be leveraged against a high-profile global assassin? The sheer scale of the demand suggested that Emanuela was no accidental target. She was a pawn in a game played in the darkest shadows of global politics. But as the years turned into decades, that geopolitical theory began to fracture, revealing something much closer to home. To find the truth, investigators had to look away from international terror and look directly at the criminal underbelly of Rome, the Banda della Magliana, the city's most brutal and powerful mafia syndicate. The theory emerged that the mafia had kidnapped Emanuela to send a blood-soaked warning to the Vatican Bank. The mob had allegedly used the sovereign church bank to launder hundreds of millions of dollars in dirty drug money that had suddenly vanished when the bank plummeted into a massive financial scandal. By snatching the daughter of a prominent Vatican insider, the mafia was holding a gun to the Pope's head, demanding their money back. This theory took a macabre, cinematic turn in 2012. Acting on an anonymous tip, Italian authorities raided the historic Basilica of Sant'Apollinare, a holy sanctuary owned by the Vatican. They weren't looking in the pews. They went down into the crypts. There, buried in a lavish, highly protected tomb surrounded by saints and popes, lay the body of Enrico de Pedis, the notorious cold-blooded boss of the Banda della Magliana. The discovery sent shockwaves through Italy. Why on earth would the Holy Catholic Church grant a brutal, murderous mob kingpin a sacred burial typically reserved for cardinals and saints? The implications were horrifying. It suggested a level of unholy collusion between the highest levels of the clergy and the lowest depths of organized crime. Rumors swirled that de Pedis' widow had paid a massive fortune to the church for the plot, or worse, that the tomb was a monument to a dark, shared secret. Just when it seemed the story couldn't get any more depraved, a second, even darker rabbit hole opened. Father Gabriele Amorth, the Vatican's chief exorcist whom we met previously, publicly stated his own conclusion on the matter. He claimed the entire international espionage angle was nothing more than an engineered smokescreen. According to Amorth, Emanuela had been kidnapped by a predatory ring of high-ranking Vatican clerics and foreign diplomats for subterranean drug-fueled parties within the Holy See, where she was eventually murdered and her body disposed of. The mystery reached a fever pitch in 2019. The Orlandi family received a cryptic, anonymous letter containing a photograph of a marble statue inside the Vatican walls. The letter contained a single spine-chilling instruction: "Look where the angel points." The statue was located in the Teutonic Cemetery, an ancient burial ground inside the Vatican. The angel pointed directly toward the ornate tombs of two 19th-century German princesses. In a rare move of cooperation, the Vatican actually agreed to open the tombs. Archaeologists, police, and the Orlandi family gathered in the quiet courtyard, bracing themselves for what they might find beneath the heavy stone slabs. When the tombs were cracked open, the room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. They didn't find Emanuela, but they didn't find the German princesses either. The tombs were entirely empty. Centuries of royal skeletal remains had vanished without a trace. Someone had scrubbed the graves clean. Today, 43 years later, Emanuela Orlandi's face still stares out from faded missing persons posters on the brick walls of Rome. After 4 decades of systematic stonewalling, deflection, and sudden silence, the Vatican has recently opened an official internal investigation into her disappearance. But as the files are dusted off and the archives are searched, the question that haunts the world isn't just where Emanuela is. It's what absolute horror is the Vatican finally preparing to admit. Chapter 4. The Bizarre Apparitions of Garabandal. If you search through the darker corners of the internet for archival footage from the early 1960s, you might stumble across a series of grainy black and white film reels that feel less like historical record and more like a lost folk horror movie. The setting is San Sebastián de Garabandal, a remote, rugged village tucked away in the foggy Cantabrian mountains of northern Spain. It's 1961. The village has no electricity, no phone lines, and is accessible only by a steep, rocky path. It is completely isolated from the modern world. The footage shows 4 young girls, Conchita, Mari Loli, Jacinta, and Mari Cruz, all between 11 and 12 years old. Suddenly, without warning, the girls drop to their knees simultaneously. The impact against the jagged, unyielding rocks is incredibly violent, a loud uniform thud that should crack their kneecaps, but they don't cry out, they don't even flinch. Instead, their heads snap backward at an unnatural angle, their necks straining, their eyes wide open, glazed and locked on a single point in the night sky. Then, they begin to move, moving with a fluid, terrifying synchronized speed. The girls begin to walk and then sprint backward. They negotiate steep, treacherous mountain terrain, sharp rocks and muddy drops in total darkness, all while their heads remain tilted straight up at the sky. They never look down, they never trip. It looks exactly like a film reel being played in reverse, defying every law of human locomotion and balance. This was the beginning of the Garabandal apparitions, a decade-long phenomenon that transformed a quiet mountain village into a theatre of raw, unsettling psychological dread. As word of these ecstatic walks spread, the village was quickly overrun. It wasn't just pious pilgrims who arrived. A small army of modern doctors, psychiatrists, and skeptical scientists descended upon Garabandal, determined to expose the girls as frauds. What they recorded instead baffled the medical establishment and left investigators deeply shaken. During these trances, the girls became entirely unresponsive to the physical world. Doctors took high-intensity spotlights and shined them directly into the girls' dilated pupils from inches away. The girls never blinked, and their eyes didn't water. Skeptics took long, thick needles and drove them deep into the girl's flesh. There was no grimace, no elevated heart rate, and remarkably, the wounds didn't bleed. Even more bizarre were the physical anomalies involving gravity and mass. Witnesses documented instances where strong, grown men would attempt to lift one of the young girls while she was in a trance, only to find her completely unmovable, as if she were chemically anchored to the earth. Yet, moments later, these same fragile girls would effortlessly lift each other up into the air, so they could reach high enough to offer a holy kiss to the invisible entity they claimed was standing before them. So what were they seeing? The girls claimed to be in communication with Saint Michael the Archangel and the Virgin Mary, but the messages they received were a far cry from the comforting, peaceful dictates usually associated with religious visions. They were handed a detailed, terrifying timeline for a 3-stage global apocalypse. The first stage was called El Aviso, the warning. The girls described it as a cataclysmic, supernatural event that would be felt by every single human being on Earth at the same time. Time, they said, would physically stop. All engines, electronics, and human movement would freeze. In that absolute silence, an internal cosmic mirror would open inside every human mind. For a few agonizing minutes, every person alive would visually and spiritually experience the exact weight of every sin, lie, and betrayal they had ever committed in their lifetime. The girls warned that many would die of sheer shock and terror from seeing the true state of their own souls. The second stage, El Milagro, the miracle, would be a massive visible sign left in the sky over the pine trees of Garabandal, something that could be photographed and televised, but never physically touched. If humanity still refused to change after these 2 cosmic wake-up calls, the final stage would trigger El Castigo, the punishment. a literal fire from heaven that would consume the world. An event this explosive couldn't remain a local secret for long. The shadow of the Vatican quickly stretched across the mountains of Spain. The Holy Office, the modern iteration of the Roman Inquisition, stepped in with an iron fist. The Vatican did not want localized, unapproved apocalyptic countdowns spreading panic. Church authorities launched a relentless psychological campaign to neutralize the situation. The girls were isolated from one another. Their private diaries and personal journals were confiscated by church officials. They were subjected to grueling, hours-long interrogations by aggressive theologians who threatened them with excommunication and spiritual damnation. Under this crushing institutional pressure, exhausted and terrified, some of the girls eventually cracked. They signed retractions, stating they had made parts of it up, or couldn't be sure of what they saw. The Vatican successfully suppressed the site, explicitly banning priests from leading pilgrimages to Garabandal and burying the official investigative files deep within their secret vaults. The girls grew up, left the village, and moved across the world, refusing to speak to journalists. But the prophecy they left behind contains a highly specific trigger mechanism. The girls stated that these apocalyptic events would begin shortly after the death of a specific sequence of popes. As history marches onward and those specific papal milestones are crossed one by one, the decades of aggressive, total silence from the Vatican starts to take on a very different context. It no longer looks like the calm skepticism of a holy institution. It looks like a group of people who checked the math, realized the clock is ticking, and are now frozen in absolute terror. Chapter 5, The Vatican Bank Scandal, Murder and Mafia Ties. On the morning of June 18, 1982, dawn broke over London's River Thames, revealing a sight that looked like a scene ripped directly from a macabre psychological thriller. Hanging from an orange nylon rope beneath Blackfriars Bridge was the lifeless body of a middle-aged man in an expensive grey suit. His name was Roberto Calvi. To the international financial world, he was the wealthy, powerful chairman of Italy's largest private bank. But to the underground networks of Europe, he was known by a far more chilling moniker, God's banker. When investigators pulled his body from the water, they discovered something profoundly bizarre. Calvi's pockets, and even the crotch of his trousers, were deliberately stuffed with heavy masonry bricks, along with over $14,000 in cash, in various currencies. The London police, with baffling speed, initially ruled the death a suicide. But think about the logistics. A wealthy international banker flies to London, walks onto a bridge in the dead of night, stuffs his own clothes with heavy construction bricks, climbs down a slippery iron scaffolding, and hangs himself. It made absolutely no sense. It wasn't a suicide. It was a ritualistic execution. The choice of location alone was a terrifying message. Blackfriars correlates directly to the Italian Frati Neri, a secret insider code name for an elite illicit Masonic lodge known as Propaganda 2, or P2. This shadow organization had deeply infiltrated the Italian government, the military, and yes, the highest echelons of the Vatican. To understand how God's banker ended up hanging under a London bridge, we have to look past the foggy Thames and straight into the sovereign walls of Vatican City. Here we meet the mastermind of the entire financial empire, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. He wasn't your typical soft-spoken spiritual cleric. He was a towering 6'3" cigar-chomping American from Cicero, Illinois, a town historically famous for its deep ties to Al Capone. Marcinkus treated the Vatican not as a temple of prayer, but as an aggressive, untouchable global corporation. He famously summed up his cynical worldview with a single quote, "You can't run the church on Hail Marys." Appointed as the head of the Vatican Bank, Marcinkus realized he possessed a golden ticket that no Wall Street executive could ever dream of. Because the Vatican is an independent sovereign state, its bank answers to no financial regulators, no tax authorities, and no outside police force. It is an absolute financial black box. Marcinkus allied the Vatican Bank with Roberto Calvi's institution, creating a sprawling, dizzying labyrinth of ghost corporations and shell companies stretching from Panama to Luxembourg. But what kind of money was flowing through this wholly unregulated pipeline? It wasn't just donations from pious Catholics. The true client list of the Vatican Bank during this era was written in blood. The pipeline was actively being used by the Sicilian Mafia, specifically the ruthless Cosa Nostra, to launder hundreds of millions of dollars generated from global heroin trafficking and massive counterfeit bond operations. The Mafia would hand stacks of dirty, blood-stained cash to Calvi. Calvi would route it into the Vatican Bank, and because the Vatican Bank was shielded by sovereign diplomatic immunity, the money would suddenly emerge on the other side of the world, completely scrubbed clean, legal, and untraceable by Italian police. It was the perfect crime, protected by the halo of the Catholic Church. But in the early 1980s, the house of cards violently collapsed. A massive hole was discovered in the bank's ledgers. An astronomical $1.3 billion had simply vanished into thin air. The mafia's money was gone, swallowed up by bad investments and corrupt kickbacks. Panic rippled through the underworld. The mafia doesn't file lawsuits. They collect debts in bodies. Terrified for his life, Calvi fled to London, knowing that losing the mob's money was a definitive death sentence. He was right. Within days of his arrival, he was dead. The horror didn't stop with Calvi. His execution triggered a terrifying, synchronized domino effect across Europe. On the exact same day, Calvi's body was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge. His personal secretary, Graziella Corocca, inexplicably fell out of a fourth-story window at the bank's headquarters in Milan. Her death was also quickly labeled a suicide, despite glaring investigative flaws. A few years later, Michele Sindona, another corrupt financier deeply tied to the Vatican mafia nexus, was arrested. He knew exactly where all the bodies were buried, and was prepared to talk. But before he could testify, he took a sip of his morning espresso inside a maximum security prison cell. The coffee had been laced with a lethal dose of potassium cyanide. He died in agony on the floor. When Italian prosecutors finally gathered enough evidence to pull back the curtain on this nightmare, they issued a series of arrest warrants. At the top of the list was Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. But the Italian police ran into a literal brick wall. The Vatican slammed its massive bronze doors shut. They officially invoked sovereign diplomatic immunity, refusing to hand over the Archbishop. Marcinkus spent years hiding inside the physical walls of the Vatican, completely unreachable by law enforcement. He eventually quietly retired to Arizona, where he died in 2006, having never spent a single day in a prison cell. The story of the Vatican Bank scandal is a chilling window into what happens when absolute spiritual authority weaponizes absolute financial secrecy. It leaves a trail of blood, money, and unanswered questions that stretches all the way from the ancient banks of the Tiber River to the cold, dark waters of the Thames. Chapter 6. The Pornocracy of Rome. When you think of the Vatican today, your mind likely conjures images of absolute serenity. You think of white smoke rising against a twilight sky, elderly, celibate men in immaculate robes, and a centuries-old tradition of quiet, holy devotion. But if we pull back the curtain of time and travel back exactly 1,100 years, that pristine image completely dissolves into a nightmare. The 10th century was an era so fundamentally depraved, so dripping with blood, corruption and vice, that Catholic historians themselves later coined a specific Latin phrase for it, the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age. But colloquially, history remembers this 60-year period by a far more scandalous, jaw-dropping title, the Pornocracy. Literally the rule of the harlots. During this time, the gatekeeper to heaven wasn't decided by theological brilliance or divine intervention. The road to the papacy ran directly through the bedroom of a single, ruthlessly brilliant Roman noblewoman. Her name was Marozia. To understand how a teenage girl seized absolute dictatorial control over the entire Christian world, you have to understand the sheer chaos of medieval Rome. It was a decaying, violent carcass of an empire, ruled by warring aristocratic families who treated the papacy like a street gang prize. Marozia, the daughter of a powerful Roman count, realized very early that in a world of monsters, you either become the apex predator or you become prey. At just 15 years old, Marozia targeted the most dangerous man in the city, Pope Sergius III. Sergius was already a textbook psychopath. He had ascended to the papal throne by orchestrating a military coup, tracking down his two immediate predecessors, throwing them into a dungeon, and having them systematically strangled to death. He was a murderer wearing the robes of Christ. Yet Marozia didn't shrink from him. She seduced him. She became his official, highly public mistress, and bore him a secret, illegitimate son. Together, Sergius and Marozia's family formed an unholy alliance where the sword met the sanctuary. No one dared to defy them. When Sergius eventually died, a succession of puppet popes followed, until a man named Pope John X took the throne. John was ambitious, and he made a fatal mistake. He forgot who actually owned him. He tried to assert his independence from Marozia. Marozia's response wasn't a theological debate or a formal excommunication. It was tactical terror. In 928 AD, Marozia commanded her personal army to storm the Lateran Palace. In a scene of absolute savagery, her soldiers dragged Pope John's brother out and butchered him right in front of the Pope's eyes, splattering the holy altar with blood. John X was bound, dragged down into the claustrophobic damp dungeons of the Castel Sant'Angelo, and locked away. A few weeks later, on Marozia's direct orders, executioners pressed a heavy leather pillow over the Pope's face, holding it down until his struggles ceased. With John X erased, Marozia executed the ultimate political flex in human history. She used her absolute stranglehold over Rome to place a new man on the papal throne, Pope John XI. He was her own 21-year-old illegitimate son, the child she had conceived years earlier with the murderous Pope Sergius III. Matrozia was no longer just pulling the strings from the shadows, she was now the literal mother of the papacy. But her genetic grip on the Holy See didn't stop there. Decades later, her teenage grandson would ascend the throne as Pope John XII. If you think modern political scandals are bad, John XII was on a completely different level. History records him as a monster who turned the sacred Vatican Palace into a literal functioning brothel. He ran high-stakes gambling rings using the church's gold, hunted animals through the holy gardens, and famously offered toasts to pagan demons during High Mass. His reign finally ended when a furious Roman husband caught the Pope in bed with his wife and beat John XII's skull in with a hammer. For over half a century, a man could not wear the fisherman's ring, draft church law, or claim to speak for God unless Marozia allowed it. She was the absolute ruler of Western Christendom. But when you build an empire on a foundation of blood, betrayal, and dark secrets, the monsters you create will eventually turn on you. Marozia's dramatic downfall didn't come from a holy rebellion or a foreign invasion. It came from her own flesh and blood. Her other son, Alberic II, grew wildly jealous of his mother's absolute power and his half-brother's papal crown. In 932 AD, during a lavish, alcohol-fueled wedding feast, Alberic launched a sudden, violent coup. He arrested his own mother, stripping her of her gold, her titles, and her freedom. Marozia was dragged down into a subterranean dungeon, locked away in pitch-black, suffocating darkness. She was left to rot there for the final 50 years of her life, doomed to sit in silence, listening to the distant bells of Rome ringing for new popes she would never see, inside the very city she once ruled with an iron fist. It is a narrative that reads like an explicit, ultra-violent historical thriller. But it is real, documented history, and it forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question. When we look at the modern church and its absolute claims to divine, unbroken spiritual authority, how much of that foundation was laid not by holy saints but by the raw, cold bloodlust and survival instincts of Rome's most dangerous woman? Chapter 7. The Vatican and the Nazi Ratlines. May 1945. The war in Europe is technically over. Berlin is a smoking mountain of rubble. Adolf Hitler is dead in his bunker, and Allied forces are sweeping across the continent in a desperate dragnet to capture the architects of the Third Reich. But in Rome, a completely different kind of operation is humming silently to life. Picture a man walking through the sunlit cobblestone streets of the Eternal City. He looks relaxed, blending in perfectly with the thousands of displaced refugees flooding Italy. He walks into a quiet church office, hands over a photograph, and moments later walks out with a brand new identity. His new passport states his name is Riccardo Clement, a stateless mechanic, but his real name is Adolf Eichmann. He is the bureaucratic mastermind behind the logistics of the Holocaust, the man directly responsible for the industrial transportation and slaughter of millions of innocent people. Eichmann didn't escape through sheer luck. He didn't slip through the Allied dragnet by hiding in the woods. He escaped because he had a travel agent wearing holy robes. This is the dark, unsettling reality of the Nazi ratlines. In the world of espionage, a ratline is a secret escape route used to extract high-value assets from hostile territory. In the chaotic aftermath of World War II, the most effective, highly organized ratline in the world ran straight through the heart of Rome, paved entirely with Vatican letterhead. At the absolute center of this web sat a man named Bishop Alois Hudol. Hudol wasn't some low-level, isolated country priest operating in the shadows. He was a highly influential, Austrian-born bishop based in Rome, a brilliant theologian and a man who was openly, fiercely sympathetic to the National Socialist cause. Years before the war ended, he had even written a book attempting to reconcile Catholic theology with Nazi ideology. To Hudol, the fall of the Third Reich wasn't a liberation. It was a cosmic tragedy that left Western Europe completely vulnerable to what he viewed as the true enemy, godless Soviet communism. He didn't see the captured SS officers and camp commandants as genocidal monsters. In his own journals, he wrote that he viewed them as vital, anti-communist soldiers who needed to be saved from victor's justice so they could fight another day. Using his immense institutional authority, Hoodle transformed the monastery of San Girolamo in Rome into a literal sanctuary, a secure, untouchable safe house where some of the most wanted war criminals on Earth could hide, eat and sleep while their escape plans were finalized. The actual mechanics of how this holy forgery pipeline operated are chillingly bureaucratic. To escape Europe, a fugitive needed a passport. But to get a passport from the International Red Cross, you first needed an identity document proving who you were. This is where the Vatican stepped in. Hoodle utilized his high-ranking position on the Vatican Refugee Committee to systematically print official Vatican identity certificates. He would fill them out with fake names, stamp them with the Holy Seal of the Church, and hand them to the hiding Nazi fugitives. When these war criminals presented their pristine Vatican documents to the Red Cross, the staff, overwhelmed by millions of genuine refugees and instinctively trusting the word of Catholic clergy, blindly accepted the papers. They issued official, legal passports under false names. This simple, elegant pipeline allowed the most sadistic minds in human history to completely vanish. Josef Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death who performed grotesque, unquantifiable medical experiments on twins and children at Auschwitz, used this exact Vatican route to flee safely to South America. Klaus Barbie, the brutal Gestapo chief known as the Butcher of Leon, escaped through it. Franz Stangl, the commandant of the Treblinka extermination camp, who personally oversaw the murder of nearly 1 million people, walked straight into Hoodle's Rome office, completely broke and desperate. Hoodle didn't just give him papers, he gave him money, lodgings and a visa to Brazil. Stangl later recounted that the bishop looked at him and said, "You must be one of those unfortunate officers. I will help you. But if you think this was just the isolated work of a few rogue radical priests operating without the Vatican's knowledge, the historical rabbit hole goes significantly deeper. As top-secret wartime archives have slowly been declassified over the decades, a far more cynical geopolitical plot has come to light. The early Western intelligence apparatus, specifically the United States Counterintelligence Corps, knew exactly what Bishop Hoodle and the Vatican networks were doing, and they chose not to stop them. Instead, they hijacked the pipeline. The Western powers realized that these fleeing Nazis possessed invaluable, deeply embedded intelligence networks and scientific expertise that could be weaponized against the Soviet Union in the looming Cold War. Western spies actively collaborated with Vatican officials, utilizing the Holy Rat Lines to smuggle high-ranking Nazi intelligence assets out of Europe, shielding them from the Nuremberg trials in exchange for their service to the West. For decades, the official stance from the Holy See has been one of plausible deniability, a tragic story of extreme charity gone wrong, where naive priests were simply tricked by clever fugitives. But the declassified files paint a much darker picture of systematic complicity. The Vatican, an institution built on the foundation of divine justice, became the ultimate shield for absolute evil. It leaves a permanent, pitch-black stain on the history of the 20th century, a reality where the hands that signed the orders for the gas chambers were warmly shaken by the hands of priests, and where the blood of millions was quietly washed away by holy water. Chapter 8. The Holy Prepuce, Jesus' foreskin. Think about the objects that have defined human obsession throughout the centuries. The Holy Grail, the True Cross, the Ark of the Covenant. These are artifacts that inspired bloody crusades, built empires, and filled the pages of epic historical literature. But what if I told you that the most fiercely contested, theologically panic-inducing, and deeply bizarre relic in the entire history of Western civilization wasn't a golden cup or a wooden cross? What if it was a tiny, wrinkled scrap of 2,000-year-old human flesh? History knows it as the Holy Prepuce. To the modern world, it is the circumcised foreskin of Jesus Christ, and for nearly 1,000 years, it was the ultimate, horrifying prize in a spiritual arms race that eventually drove the Vatican to the brink of absolute institutional panic. To understand how a piece of anatomy became a geopolitical weapon, you have to look at the ruthless economy of the medieval church. In the Middle Ages, relics weren't just objects of quiet devotion, they were massive corporate assets. If a cathedral or monastery managed to secure a holy artifact, it became a literal goldmine. It drew thousands of wealthy pilgrims, which brought immense commerce, political leverage, and papal favors. The ultimate, unattainable prize was a physical piece of Jesus himself. But Orthodox Christian theology presented a massive obstacle. According to doctrine, Jesus physically ascended into heaven with his entire unbroken body. Logically, no skeletal remains or flesh could be left on earth, except for one loophole: the flesh removed during his childhood circumcision. Suddenly, a frantic, chaotic scramble erupted across Europe. Every king, bishop, and monk wanted a piece of the Savior. The resulting historical timeline reads like a surreal black comedy. At its peak in the medieval era, no fewer than 18 different European churches and cathedrals simultaneously claimed to possess the only authentic holy prepuce. The Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne claimed he was gifted one by an angel. Another monastery in France claimed their specimen miraculously wept actual drops of human blood when touched by a priest. It was a theological and biological nightmare that the Vatican struggled to regulate. As the centuries rolled on, the intellectual gymnastics required to defend this relic grew even more unsettlingly profound. In the 17th century, a highly respected Vatican scholar named Leo Eliashos took the obsession into deep space. Galileo's newly invented telescope had recently revealed the mysterious, unexplained rings circling the planet Saturn, throwing the scientific and religious communities into utter confusion. Eliashos published a serious, heavily researched and Vatican-approved treatise to solve the cosmic mystery. His conclusion? When Jesus ascended to heaven, his holy foreskin ascended separately, drifted out into the cosmos, and physically expanded to become the rings of Saturn, he wrote. The physical remnants of the divine could not be bound by earthly physics. They expanded to cover the heavens. But by the turn of the 20th century, the Enlightenment had arrived. Science was advancing, and the Vatican found itself looking profoundly ridiculous. The absolute obsession with a piece of ancient savior anatomy had transformed from a medieval goldmine into a modern public relations catastrophe. In 1900, Pope Leo XIII decided he had seen enough. The Vatican didn't just issue a statement, they dropped an ecclesiastical hammer. They released a sweeping, terrifyingly strict decree stating that anyone cleric or layman who spoke, wrote, or publicly debated the existence of the holy prepuce would face instant, automatic excommunication from the Catholic Church. They didn't want to settle the debate, they wanted to erase it from human memory. But one remote place completely refused to comply. The tiny, ancient Italian village of Calcutta. Perched precariously atop a jagged volcanic cliff north of Rome, Calcutta had possessed what was widely considered the most authentic version of the relic since 1527, preserved inside a magnificent jewel-encrusted gold reliquary. Because of the village's isolation, the Vatican quietly tolerated them. Every single year on the Feast of the Circumcision, the local priest would lead a grand procession, proudly parading the sacred flesh through the winding fog-choked stone streets as the entire town cheered. Until 1983, just before the annual festival was set to begin, the parish priest, Father Dario Magnoni, went down to his heavily locked safe to retrieve the artifact. The ornate, gold-plated box was exactly where he had left it. But when he lifted the lid, the velvet interior was bare. The relic was completely gone. The theft was immediately met with a suffocating, unnatural wall of silence. No ransom notes were ever sent, no windows were broken, no locks were picked. Strangely, Father Magnoni refused to cooperate with secular Italian police, and the Vatican showed absolutely zero interest in tracking down the thieves who had stolen a literal piece of God. This total lack of institutional urgency sparked a chilling conspiracy theory that haunts Calcutta to this day. The locals didn't blame international art thieves or mafia smugglers. They pointed their fingers directly at Rome. The theory suggests that the Vatican, desperate to permanently sever its connection to a deeply embarrassing medieval relic in an increasingly modern, cynical world, hired professional covert operatives to break into their own church. They stole the artifact not for profit, but for absolute erasure. If the conspiracy is true, it means the relic wasn't lost to history by common criminals. It means it was brought home, smuggled past the Swiss Guard, and locked away in the pitch-black darkness of the deepest vault within the secret archives, hidden forever from a world that had finally grown too modern for its secrets. Chapter 9. The Kidnapping of Pier Fortunato Zanfretta. December 6, 1978. Midnight. A brutal, icy wind howls through the dark mountain passes of Torriglia, a small, isolated village tucked away in the rugged hills near Genoa, Italy. Pier Fortunato Zanfretta, a 26-year-old night watchman, is driving his routine patrol route. He is a down-to-earth ex-military man, completely unprone to flights of fancy or overactive imagination. To him, tonight is just another cold, boring shift checking on the empty summer villas of wealthy city dwellers. As he navigates his patrol car down the narrow, pitch-black driveway of a private estate in the village of Marzano, the vehicle's engine suddenly sputters and dies. The headlights flicker out, plunging him into total darkness. At the same time, the radio goes completely dead. Zanfretta steps out of the car, adjusting his flashlight. That's when he notices a strange, pulsing glow coming from the garden behind the main villa. 4 distinct bright lights are weaving through the trees. Suspecting a group of sophisticated burglars, Zanfretta draws his heavy service revolver, clicks off the safety, and creeps silently into the shadows. He rounds the corner of the house, ready to catch the intruders red-handed. He raises his flashlight, ready to demand a surrender. But the words catch in his throat. Zanfretta feels a sudden freezing touch on his shoulder, a sensation so intensely cold it bites through his thick winter uniform. He spins around, raising his gun. His flashlight beam cuts through the dark and illuminates something that completely defies human comprehension. Towering over him is a massive creature, easily nearly 10 feet tall. Its skin is a mottled, deep green, covered in rough triangular scales like a reptile. Its face features enormous, luminous yellow eyes shaped like inverted triangles, and strange organic spikes protrude from its hairless skull. As Zanfretta stares in absolute horror, a wave of intense, suffocating heat begins to emanate from the giant entity, clashing violently with its icy touch. Zanfretta drops his flashlight, gasps for air, and collapses onto the frozen grass, passing out from sheer paralyzing terror. Hours later, his fellow guards find his patrol car abandoned, its doors flung wide open. They search the pitch-black grounds of the villa, calling his name. Finally, they find Zanfretta huddled in a dense thicket at the edge of the property. He is completely catatonic, his eyes wide and unblinking, blindly pointing his service weapon into the empty dark. Despite spending hours exposed to the sub-zero winter air, Zanfretta's clothes are burning hot to the touch. His skin is heavily flushed, and his uniform radiates a strange, unnatural warmth, as if he had just been pulled from a furnace. The Carabinieri, the Italian military police, don't just dismiss the night watchman as a lunatic. They launch a rigorous, clinical, forensic investigation of the estate. What they discover changes the entire narrative from a psychological episode into an undeniable physical crime scene. In the grass, precisely where Zanfretta claimed the creature stood, the military police find a massive, horseshoe-shaped crater indented deep into the frozen earth, measuring over 18 feet wide. When forensic teams analyze the soil samples within the imprint, they are left utterly baffled. The dirt and stone have been completely vitrified. The intense, concentrated heat of whatever landed there had literally melted the ground, turning it into a smooth layer of volcanic glass. Furthermore, the surrounding pine trees show signs of extreme thermal radiation, their needles scorched and dried out from the inside out. The nightmare, however, was only beginning. Over the next 2 years, Zanfretta claimed he was abducted an additional 11 times from the same remote hills. Desperate for answers, he agreed to undergo professional regression hypnosis overseen by prominent Italian neurologists and investigative journalists. The audio recordings of those sessions are profoundly chilling. When the doctors guide the sedated watchman back to the moments of his encounters, his calm, working-class demeanor completely shatters. His voice distorts into a guttural, breathless, terrified scream. He describes being led into blinding metallic chambers and taken deep underground into massive subterranean facilities hidden right beneath the rolling Italian countryside. But as independent researchers later began mapping the precise locations of Zanfretta's encounters and the coordinates he provided under hypnosis, a bizarre institutional pattern emerged. The remote mountain properties, the isolated valleys where the lights were repeatedly seen, and the exact plots of land where the vitrified earth was discovered, weren't just random wilderness. They were massive estates heavily owned, guarded and controlled by local Catholic dioceses, ancient religious trusts, and wealthy Vatican-connected entities. Why were these terrifying anomalies occurring almost exclusively on land protected by the Church? For centuries, rumors have swirled that the Vatican guards hidden knowledge regarding non-human intelligence, maintaining quiet, highly secure buffer zones around the world. Was this isolated patch of Church-owned territory chosen by an unearthly presence as a safe haven, knowing that religious boundaries would keep the curious public away? Or worse, did the Church authorities know exactly what was operating beneath their holy ground? State doctors eventually ruled Zanfretta to be entirely sane, with no history of mental illness or hallucinations. The physical evidence stands on the Italian police logs to this day. Was Pier Fortunato Zanfretta the victim of an elaborate, highly classified psychological military experiment conducted on sovereign land? Or did an ordinary night watchman accidentally stumble onto a terrifying, non-human presence actively hiding right beneath the soil protected by the Church? Chapter 10. The murder of the Vatican's Swiss Guard commander. The Pontifical Swiss Guard is the oldest active military unit in the world. For over 5 centuries they have stood watch over the successor of Peter. Instantly recognizable by their vibrant Renaissance-era striped uniforms and traditional halberds, they are celebrated as symbols of absolute loyalty, medieval pageantry, and pristine security. They have not seen combat since the sack of Rome in 1527, but on the evening of May 4, 1998, The historic barracks of the Swiss Guard echoed with a sound that hadn't been heard inside the Vatican walls for generations: gunfire. At 9 p.m., the chaplain discovered a horrific scene inside an official Vatican apartment. Slumped on the floor lay Alois Esterman, the newly appointed 43-year-old commander of the Swiss Guard. Next to him was his Venezuelan wife, Gladys Meza Romero. Both had been shot multiple times at close range. A few feet away lay the body of 23-year-old Vice Corporal Cédric Tournay, a young Swiss Guard, dead from a single bullet to the head. His service pistol rested beneath his body. The timing of the slaughter was incredibly unsettling. Only a few hours earlier, Pope John Paul II had personally promoted Esterman to commander, fulfilling Esterman's lifelong career ambition. What followed next is where the story shifts from a tragic double homicide into a masterclass in institutional damage control. Within less than 3 hours of the bodies being found, long before a forensic team could map the blood spatter, before ballistics tests were run, and before an autopsy had even begun, the Vatican's chief spokesperson, Joaquin Navarro Valls, called an emergency press conference. He presented the global media with a neat, completely closed narrative. The Vatican declared that Vice Corporal Cédric Tournay had suffered a sudden fit of madness brought on by a psychological grievance. Esterman had reportedly denied Tournay a routine military decoration, the Benemerenti Medal, due to a disciplinary infraction. In a blind rage, Tournay executed his commander and his commander's wife, then turned the gun on himself. Case closed. The Vatican buried the bodies, cleaned the apartment, and prepared to move on. But outside the sovereign walls of Rome, the official story immediately began to disintegrate. Cédric Tournay's mother, Muguette Baudin, completely refused to accept the Vatican's script. She described her son as a well-adjusted, enthusiastic young man who was looking forward to returning home to Switzerland, not a homicidal maniac. Desperate for the truth, she hired independent European forensic pathologists and handwriting experts to review the limited evidence the Vatican released. What they uncovered was deeply disturbing. Independent anatomical analysis of Tournay's skull revealed that the entry of the fatal bullet was at the back of his head, dropping downward through his mouth, a trajectory that is nearly physically impossible to achieve in a self-inflicted shooting with a standard-issue military pistol. The forensic report showed that Tournay's front teeth were heavily broken and shattered before the firearm was discharged, strongly indicating a violent physical struggle with an unknown assailant before his death. The Vatican produced a handwritten suicide note addressed to Tournay's mother, supposedly penned moments before the killings. However, independent graphologists compared the text to Tournay's past letters and declared it a blatant, clumsy forgery. The vocabulary used didn't match his native idioms, and the handwriting style was fundamentally different. If Cédric Tournay didn't snap, then he wasn't a murderer, he was a scapegoat. And if he was a scapegoat, someone went to extraordinary lengths to cover up why the commander of the Swiss Guard actually had to die. The historical investigation splits into two distinct, terrifying rabbit holes. The first involves the ghost of the Cold War. Following the collapse of the Berlin Wall, declassified documents from the East German Stasi began to trickle out. Rumors exploded that Alois Esterman hadn't just been a dedicated Swiss soldier. He was allegedly a deep-cover operative for East German foreign intelligence, operating under the codename Werwolf since the early 1980s. His mission? To spy on Pope John Paul II and monitor the Vatican's secret financial pipeline to the Polish anti-communist movement. Did someone find out his double identity on the very day of his promotion? The second theory points to a brutal internal religious power struggle. In 1998, a quiet but fierce war was being waged inside the Vatican bureaucracy between traditionalist, highly influential societies like Opus Dei and hidden Masonic factions competing for control of the Holy See's security and intelligence apparatus. Esterman was rumoured to be deeply aligned with Opus Dei's interests, and his ascension to commander would have locked down total control over the physical security of the Pope. To this day, the Vatican maintains its original 1998 ruling of a tragic murder-suicide, refusing to reopen the case or grant outside law enforcement access to their internal files. The truth remains locked behind the heavy stone walls of the city-state, protected by the very security apparatus that failed to save its own commander. Chapter 11. The Legion of Christ and the Depravity of Martial Messiel. In the long, dark history of institutional cover-ups, there are figures who operate in the shadows, and then there are those who hide in the absolute blinding brightness of spiritual adoration. For more than half a century, the Vatican revered Father Martial Messiel as one of its greatest modern saints. Pope John Paul II publicly lauded him as an efficacious guide to youth, pointing to his religious order, the Legionaries of Christ, as the vibrant future of the Catholic Church. But beneath the immaculate vestments, the flawless public piety, and the multi-million-dollar global empire lay a reality so profoundly depraved it would eventually shake the Holy See to its very foundations. Martial Maciel was not just a rogue priest. He was a master manipulator, a financial genius, and a serial predator who successfully weaponized the structure of the Catholic Church to shield himself from earthly justice. Founded by Maciel in Mexico in 1941, the Legionaries of Christ operated less like a traditional religious order and more like a highly disciplined corporate paramilitary force for God. Maciel systematically targeted the wealthy elite of Mexico, Europe, and the United States, establishing prestigious private schools and universities. By cultivating intimate relationships with billionaires and powerful political dynasties, the Legion generated an astronomical amount of wealth. To the Vatican hierarchy, Maciel was an indispensable miracle worker. In an era where traditional vocations were plummeting throughout the Western world, Maciel's seminaries were overflowing with clean-cut, fiercely devoted young men, and his financial pipelines were funneling millions into Rome's coffers. But the true genius of his design lay in how he structured the internal psychology of the Legion. He instituted a mandatory, top-secret vow of private charity that every member was forced to take. This vow explicitly forbade any legionary from ever criticizing a superior, questioning Maciel actions, or speaking out about internal matters to anyone outside the order. This vow transformed the Legionaries of Christ into a perfect, self-policing echo chamber. It completely stripped young seminarians of their agency, ensuring that any whisper of misconduct would be immediately crushed as a sin against charity. For decades, it created an impenetrable wall of silence. Behind that wall, Maciel lived a double life that bordered on the surreal. For years, he traveled the world under multiple aliases, utilizing forged passports and hidden church money to maintain entirely separate families. He fathered at least 3 children with 2 different women, all while maintaining his public persona as a celibate mystic. Far more horrifyingly, Maciel subjected dozens of young boys, including his own seminarians and biological children, to systematic sexual and psychological abuse. He would frequently abuse young victims, then immediately force them to hear his confession, chillingly tangling his crimes with holy sacraments. The most damning aspect of the Maciel scandal is not simply the depravity of his actions, but the reality that the Vatican knew about it for decades. As early as the 1940s, detailed complaints from escaped seminarians had reached Rome. Holy See investigators briefly suspended Maciel during an inquiry in 1956, but his immense wealth, political connections, and deep-pocketed allies inside the Roman Curia quickly intervened. Powerful Vatican figures consistently shielded Maciel from investigation, brushing aside the victims' desperate pleas as malicious conspiracies aimed at destroying a holy man. It wasn't until the twilight of John Paul II's papacy that the armor cracked. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger defied powerful internal resistance and formally opened an investigation into Maciel. In May 2006, a year after Ratzinger became Pope Benedict XVI, the Vatican finally dropped the hammer. Recognizing that Maciel was too old and the scandal too explosive for a public trial, the Pope stripped Maciel of his public ministry and exiled him to a life of prayer and penance in Florida. He died there in 2008, never facing a secular courtroom, never spending a single day in a prison cell, and showing zero public remorse. In 2010, the Vatican issued an unprecedented public statement, finally admitting that Maciel's life was entirely devoid of religious sentiment, and describing his actions as those of a criminal. The revelation that a literal monster had been protected, validated, and embraced at the highest levels of spiritual power remains a permanent, bleeding wound for the Church, a stark reminder of what happens when institutional survival is prioritized over human lives. Chapter 12. The Chronovisor. The Vatican's suppressed time machine. May 1972. Newsstands across Italy carry an issue of the popular magazine La Domenica del Corriere, with a headline that borders on pure science fiction. The publication claims that a team of world-class scientists, led by a Benedictine monk, had successfully conquered the linear constraints of time. As absolute, undeniable proof of this breakthrough, they published a photograph, a haunting, agonizing close-up of the face of Jesus Christ looking upward in agony during his crucifixion. The media frenzy was instantaneous, but this wasn't a standard tabloid hoax cooked up for cheap sales. The man at the center of the controversy was Father Pellegrino Ernetti. Ernetti was not a fringe conspiracy theorist or a delusional hermit. He was a highly respected intellectual, a brilliant musicologist, an authority on ancient archaic languages, and a trained physicist. According to Ernetti, the realization that humanity could look into the past wasn't an accident. It was the result of a secret, post-war collaboration in the 1950s involving 12 of the most brilliant scientific minds on Earth. Among this shadow cabinet of genius were reportedly two towering figures of 20th century science: Enrico Fermi, the Nobel Prize-winning architect of the nuclear age, and Wernher von Braun, the legendary rocket pioneer who put humanity on the moon. Together, they built a device known as the Chronovisor. The underlying concept behind the Chronovisor was a brilliant piece of theoretical physics that Ernesti called the science of ghosts. The fundamental principle was elegant. When an event occurs in human history, the light and sound waves emitted by that action do not simply cease to exist when the moment passes. Instead, energy cannot be destroyed, it is merely transformed. Ernesti reasoned that these ancient visual and auditory waves remain floating through the fabric of space-time, fading into microscopic, lingering frequencies that are completely imperceptible to the human eye and ear. The Chronovisor was essentially a highly advanced cosmic receiver. By utilizing a complex array of cathode ray tubes, specialized antennae, and precious metal alloys, the machine could be tuned to a specific historical coordinate, capture these residual frequencies, and reconstruct them directly onto a viewing screen, like a television broadcast from the past. The separation of past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. Everything that has happened remains preserved in the energy waves of the universe. This was the theosophical principle underlying Ernesti's work. To prove the machine's terrifying capabilities to his peers, Ernesti claimed his team didn't just look back at biblical times. They turned the Chronovisor's dials to ancient Rome in the year 169 BC. There they watched the staging of a legendary lost tragedy titled Thyestes, written by the father of Roman poetry Quintus Ennius. The play had been lost to history for thousands of years, with only a few fragmented verses surviving in modern textbooks. Yet Ernesti shocked the academic world by transcribing the entire text of the play perfectly, down to the specific archaic Latin idioms of the era, a feat that would require either a working time machine or an impossibly flawless superhuman knowledge of lost linguistics. But just as the international scientific community began demanding a public, verified demonstration of the device, the entire project was violently and completely vaporized from the public record. The machine was reportedly dismantled into its component parts. The 12 world-class scientists who worked on the project went completely silent, refusing to ever speak of the device again. The Vatican stepped in with absolute institutional brutality. In a series of swift, severe decrees culminating in the late 20th century, the Holy See officially declared that anyone who attempted to manufacture, possess, or utilize a device with the operational capabilities of the Chronovisor would face instant automatic excommunication, the most severe spiritual penalty the Catholic Church can enforce. The global public was left to assume the entire story was a sophisticated academic prank. But the final, unsettling twist came in 1994, as Father Ernesti lay on his deathbed, fading fast. He reportedly penned a final, confidential letter to his closest confidants. He didn't recant his story to save his soul. Instead, he reaffirmed that the Chronovisor was completely real. He explained that the team had voluntarily chosen to hide the technology away because in the wrong hands, a machine that can see everything would create the most absolute, inescapable dictatorship the world has ever seen. Privacy would cease to exist. Every political betrayal, every military secret, and every historical truth would be laid bare. If the Chronovisor exists inside the Vatican vaults, it means they don't just guard the history written in books. It means they hold a lens to every secret, every lie, and every crime ever committed in human history, and they will never let you see it. Chapter 13. The Shroud of Turin's Photographic Negative, May 28, 1898. Turin, Italy. An amateur photographer named Secondo Pia stands inside a cramped, dimly lit darkroom, watching a glass photographic plate submerge into a chemical developer bath. The room smells heavily of sulfur and vinegar. Pia is developing the first-ever photographs of the Shroud of Turin, a centuries-old faded linen cloth revered by millions as the authentic burial garment of Jesus Christ. To the naked eye, the shroud is an underwhelming relic. It features nothing more than a faint, sepia-toned, blurry imprint of a human body, so ghostly that you have to stand several feet back just to distinguish its contours. Secondo Pia expects his photographic negative to show an even more distorted, unrecognizable blur. He lifts the glass plate out of the chemicals, holding it up to a faint amber safe light. He freezes. His hands begin to violently shake, nearly dropping the fragile glass plate onto the floor. What stares back at him is not a chaotic, reversed mess of shadows. In reverse exposure, the faint, muddy lines of the shroud completely invert. The negative plate reveals a stunningly sharp, hyper-realistic, three-dimensional portrait of a muscular man with a bearded face, closed eyes, and unmistakable signs of severe physical trauma. Secondo Pia had just stumbled onto an impossible scientific anomaly. For a photographic negative to produce a perfectly clear, realistic positive image, the original object itself must be a negative. The realization was chilling. How could a piece of ancient linen cloth function as a mathematically perfect photographic negative centuries, if not millennia, before the invention of the camera? To find out, science had to stop looking at the shroud as a religious icon and start analyzing it as a forensic crime scene. Over the next several decades, pathologists, radiologists, and anthropologists subjected the cloth to a relentless anatomical autopsy. What they discovered completely shattered the typical conventions of medieval art. If the shroud is a forgery, the artist possessed an intimate, flawless understanding of Roman execution practices that had been completely lost to history for over 1,000 years. Every medieval painting of the crucifixion depicts nails driven directly through the palms of Jesus' hands. But forensic science knows this is an anatomical impossibility. The flesh of the palm cannot support the weight of a human body and would instantly tear away from the cross. The man on the shroud, however, was nailed through the wrists, specifically through a space known as destot space. When a spike enters this precise anatomical location, it forces the thumb to involuntarily flex inward against the palm. On the shroud, the man's thumbs are completely hidden from view. Medieval artists simply did not know this detail existed. Furthermore, microscopic analysis conducted directly on the fabric fibers revealed the presence of actual human blood, sweat, and urea. But the blood hadn't been painted on. There are no brush strokes, no pigments, and no binders. Most bizarrely, the image contains no capillary action, meaning no liquid ever soaked through or bled out into the surrounding threads. The ghostly golden-yellow image of the man is locked entirely within the absolute topmost layer of the linen, penetrating less than a fraction of a hair's width deep. It is a surface coloration completely devoid of chemical additives. This physical mystery sparked an all-out war within the international scientific community. The tension reached a boiling point in 1978 when the Vatican granted unprecedented access to the Shroud of Turin research project called STURP. This was an elite 24-member team composed of NASA physicists, thermal imaging specialists, and nuclear scientists. The STURP team locked themselves in a room with the relic for 120 consecutive hours, deploying advanced X-ray fluorescence, ultraviolet spectroscopy, and atomic particle detectors. They poked, prodded, and scanned every square millimeter of the cloth. Their final official report sent shockwaves through the secular world. The image was not painted, it was not dyed, it was not printed, and it was not scorched by a hot iron. Science simply could not explain how the image was physically manufactured. 10 years later, the skeptics struck back with a vengeance. In 1988, the Vatican allowed 3 independent, world-renowned laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and the University of Arizona to cut a small sliver from the corner of the shroud for carbon-14 radiocarbon dating. The results dropped like a hammer. The labs concluded with 95% confidence that the flax linen used to weave the shroud dated back to somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD. The global media immediately declared the case closed. The Shroud of Turin was nothing more than a brilliant, highly sophisticated medieval hoax. But the forensic timeline refused to die. Decades later, textile experts and independent researchers uncovered a critical flaw in the 1988 testing protocol. The laboratories had all sampled from a single, identical corner of the fabric, a section known as the Rava corner. Historical records revealed that this exact corner had been severely handled, burned during a church fire in 1532, and subsequently repaired by medieval Poor Clare nuns using a highly specialized, invisible French weaving technique. The labs hadn't tested the original ancient shroud fabric. They had accidentally tested a hybrid patch of medieval cotton thread woven into the linen to repair centuries of wear and tear, completely skewing the radiation data. We are left standing on the edge of a profound intellectual precipice. If the shroud is indeed a medieval fake, it means an anonymous creator living in the Dark Ages possessed a mastery of optical physics, forensic pathology, and blood chemistry that surpassed even Leonardo da Vinci, creating a masterpiece specifically designed to only be fully understood after the invention of photography in the 19th century. But if it is real, physics offers only one terrifying explanation for how that perfect three-dimensional photographic negative was burned onto the fibers. It would require an instantaneous, unimaginably intense flash of high-energy radiation emitted from every single cell of a dead body at the exact same microsecond. The image is not a painting. It is an atomic photograph of a resurrection. Chapter 14. The Capuchin Crypt. The Architecture of Death. Step off the sunlit, noisy pavement of Rome's Via Veneto, a street famous for its luxury hotels and bustling outdoor cafes. Walk through the heavy doors of the 17th century Church of Santa Maria della Concezione and follow a narrow stone staircase leading directly into the subterranean underbelly of the building. Instantly, the ambient roar of Italian traffic vanishes. The temperature drops dramatically, chilling the air. Your senses adjust to a heavy, suffocating aroma, a mixture of damp limestone, alkaline dust, and the faint, sweet, unmistakable trace of ancient preservation. You quickly realize you aren't entering a standard graveyard or a quiet underground cemetery. You are walking into a series of rooms where human death has been meticulously repurposed as high Baroque interior design. Welcome to the Capuchin Crypt. Look up at the ceiling. Those aren't ornate metal light fixtures hanging above you. They are elaborate, multi-tiered chandeliers crafted entirely from human vertebrae. The sweeping architectural arches framing the rooms are constructed from interlocking pelvises. The walls themselves are wrapped in dense, symmetrical Baroque patterns, intricately woven geometric shapes, floral designs, and mock moldings built from thousands of ribs, jawbones, and tiny finger joints belonging to 3,700 Capuchin friars. To understand how this nightmare of anatomy came to exist, we have to look back to the year 1631. The Capuchin friars were moving from their old convent to this newly constructed monastery, but they refused to leave their deceased brothers behind in abandoned soil. They loaded up 300 massive cartloads of skeletal remains and transported them across the city. The Pope's brother, Cardinal Antonio Barberini, who was himself a proud member of the Capuchin order, ordered that the soil for this new crypt floor be shipped across the Mediterranean directly from Jerusalem. They created a holy foundation where a friar could be buried, decompose over a few decades, and then be exhumed to make room for the next death, with his bones joining the decor. To a modern viewer, this looks like the work of a deeply disturbed mind, or a macabre cult sect. But to the historical Catholic mind, it was an act of profound, tender devotion. This is the physical, uncompromising reality of memento mori, the ancient practice of actively meditating on the inevitability of death to strip away earthly vanity. The friars didn't build this to terrify the public. They built it as a quiet classroom for their own souls, a place to look at their ancestors and remember that time is fleeting. There is a bizarre structural fact about this design that trips up almost everyone who visits. The thousands of bones are not held together by heavy cement, modern glue, or thick plaster. The friars painstakingly balanced each skull, rib, and femur against the next, securing them to the underlying brickwork using nothing but thin, flexible wire. Because of this delicate, tension-based engineering, the architecture of death is not entirely still. It reacts to the modern metropolis above. Every time a heavy subway train rumbles deep beneath the Roman soil, or a city bus roars past on the asphalt outside, the entire skeletal structure experiences micro-vibrations. The bones gently click, rattle, and settle against one another in the dark, a silent, shifting monument that breathes with the movement of the city. As you guide your footsteps further down the narrow, stone-paved corridor, the tour escalates through 5 distinct chambers: the Crypt of the Resurrection, the Crypt of the Skulls, and the Crypt of the Pelvises. Here, the abstract nature of the patterns gives way to something far more visceral. Standing upright inside specialized alcoves woven out of stacked leg bones are fully intact, mummified skeletons of friars. They aren't bare bone. They are still draped in their original, coarse brown woolen holy robes, cinched tightly at the waist with knotted ropes. Their heads are slumped forward at unnatural angles, their hollow pitch-black eye sockets staring directly down at you as you pass their alcoves. The spatial tour reaches its ultimate chilling climax in the Crypt of the Three Skeletons. Look directly at the plaster ceiling. Nailed to the center is the tiny, delicate skeleton of a young child, a Roman princess, the great niece of Pope Sixtus V, who died in infancy. The friars did not spare her from the architecture. They fashioned her into a permanent, allegorical depiction of the Grim Reaper. In her tiny, bony right hand, she grips a scythe crafted entirely out of human bone fragments. In her left, she holds a pair of scales, balances made of vertebrae. She floats above the room, a silent reminder that death does not bargain with age, wealth, or innocence. As you turn back toward the stone steps to ascend back to the warmth of the modern world, your eyes catch a small weathered plaque mounted directly above the exit. It is a final address from the 3,700 silent souls lining the walls, a message stripped of all comfort. It reads, "What you are now, we once were. What we are now, you shall be." You walk back up into the blinding Italian sunlight, the noise of the traffic washing over you once more, but the damp, heavy chill of the underbelly stays locked in your bones for hours. Chapter 15. The Secret Archives. Whispers in the Vault. For centuries, whispered rumors circulated about a fortress of forbidden knowledge buried deep beneath the heart of Rome. It wasn't a myth. Known for generations as the Archivio Segreto Vaticano, the Vatican's secret archives, this legendary repository is far more clinical and far more terrifying than a simple room of dusty books. It is a massive, multi-level subterranean concrete bunker built directly beneath a secure Vatican courtyard. This structure, nicknamed the bunker, was engineered with thick reinforced concrete walls specifically designed to survive a high-yield nuclear blast. But it isn't protecting physical lives down there. It is protecting information. Inside this underground vault rests an astounding 53 miles of continuous, tightly packed shelving. For over 800 years, this silent maze has housed the absolute core of global history. Top-secret diplomatic correspondence, confidential papal bulls, state secrets, and the unedited transcripts of heretical trials. Yet, you will never walk its halls. This is the ultimate invisible library. The public, and even standard academics, are completely banned from entering the stacks. There is no browsing, no wandering the corridors, and no open digital catalogue to scroll through. To view a document, you must be a highly vetted, pre-approved researcher who already knows the exact hyper-specific file name and index code of the manuscript you want. If you don't know the precise name of the file, the indexers will simply tell you it doesn't exist. If a secret has no name, it remains buried in the dark forever. What little we do know about the contents of these vaults comes from a handful of heavily curated anomalies that the Church has seen fit to reveal over the centuries. These aren't just old pieces of paper, they are the literal pivot points of human civilization. Tucked away in the dark is the original letter sent by the English House of Lords to Pope Clement VII. It is a massive, imposing parchment signed by 85 English nobles, each signature accompanied by an individual, dangling red wax seal. The demand was simple: annul King Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The Pope's stubborn refusal is preserved right alongside it, a rejection that shattered the continent, birthed the Church of England, and altered global politics for half a millennium. For centuries, the ultimate fate of the legendary Knights Templar was shrouded in mystery and blood, but hidden within the archives lay the Chinan Parchmentong, the lost trial document. It reveals a stunning act of papal betrayal. Pope Clement V had actually found the Templars innocent and secretly absolved them of all heresy. Yet, facing intense political pressure and execution threats from King Philip IV of France, the Pope chose to suppress his own ruling, allowing the knights to be systematically hunted down, tortured and burned at the stake anyway. The document was suspiciously misplaced in the wrong filing cabinet for hundreds of years. Among the shelves rests the original, ink-stained transcript of Galileo Galilei's historic 1633 trial. You can see the exact place on the page where the aging genius was forced to press his quill to the parchment, signing a forced recantation while kneeling before the Inquisition. He was compelled to state that his scientific proof that the Earth revolves around the Sun was a heresy. The ink stands as a monument to a moment when institutional power successfully ordered the universe to sit still. In 2019, the Vatican executed a brilliant public relations maneuver. Pope Francis officially changed the institution's name from the Secret Archives to the Vatican Apostolic Archives. The Church claimed the word secret was a simple mistranslation of the Latin secretum, which closer translates to private or personal. But changing the letterhead didn't unlock the concrete doors. The bureaucratic gatekeeping remains completely absolute, particularly regarding anything written after the year 1939. The deepest, most aggressively guarded sector of the archive contains the records of Pope Pius XII, the controversial wartime pope. For decades, historians have desperately clawed for unfettered access to these files, trying to determine why Pius XII maintained a public stance of chilling silence as the horrors of the Holocaust unfolded across Europe. While select portions have been trickled out, the vast majority of the modern intelligence files, wartime correspondence, and diplomatic cables remain heavily restricted. The psychological reality of this layout is deeply unsettling. The Vatican maintains a permanent, highly vetted team of elite paleographers, specialists trained to read, decode, and translate ancient, obscure handwriting. These scholars live and work within the bureaucratic machinery of the Church. Their job isn't just preservation, it's triage. They comb through, transcribe, and analyze these documents long before any outside eyes are ever granted a glimpse. It begs a paranoiac question: what exactly are they looking for in those old lines of ink? What are they scrubbing or contextualizing before the world is allowed to see it? This brings us to the ultimate, chilling realization. The handful of documents the Vatican has voluntarily pulled from the shadows are pieces of history that literally redrew the borders of empires, shattered religious institutions, and attempted to dictate the laws of planetary motion. Those are the files they consider safe for public consumption. If the documents they let us look at had the power to reshape the entire modern world, what does the timeline look like for the files they keep completely hidden? What cosmic truths, historical conspiracies, or structural cover-ups are buried deep within those 53 miles of nuclear blast-proof concrete? What are the secrets they would kill to keep in the dark? Chapter 16. Padre Pio and the Vatican Wiretaps. San Giovanni Rotondo, Italy, 1960. Inside a dimly lit, stiflingly humid church, thousands of weeping pilgrims pack the pews, having travelled from across the globe just to catch a glimpse of a humble Capuchin friar. Sitting deep within the shadows of a wooden confessional box is Padre Pio. His face is weathered by exhaustion, and his hands are permanently encased in thick, fingerless woolen gloves. Beneath those gloves lie open, unhealing, bleeding wounds in his palms, mirroring the crucifixion wounds of Jesus Christ. Weirdly, the air around his confessional doesn't smell of sweat or old wood. It carries an intense supernatural aroma of fresh roses. But if you look past the kneeling penitents and follow the base of that sacred wooden booth, a terrifyingly earthly reality emerges. Hidden meticulously inside the woodwork, a thin electrical wire runs out from under Padre Pio's seat, snakes through a hole drilled into the stone floor, and disappears into an adjacent building. The tape reels are spinning. The Vatican is recording his every whisper. This wasn't a secular wiretap set up by the Italian mafia or communist spies. The espionage operation was conceived, funded, and executed by the Roman Catholic Church itself. To the global public, Padre Pio was a living saint, capable of miraculous healings and reading souls. But to the Roman Curia, the Vatican's administrative governing body, he was a dangerous rogue cult leader who wielded an uncomfortably absolute power over the masses. The institutional paranoia reached the absolute highest levels of power. Pope John the 23rd and the Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office, the terrifying bureaucratic department formerly known as the Spanish Inquisition, were utterly convinced that Padre Pio was a brilliant, manipulative con man. They viewed his mass following not as a revival of faith, but as a direct, destabilizing threat to papal authority. To smash his influence, the Vatican treated the monastery of San Giovanni Rotondo like a hostile foreign territory, deploying Cold War espionage tactics to gather intelligence. They sent an official apostolic visitor, Monsignor Carlo Maccari, to launch a covert investigation. Maccari didn't just interview local witnesses, he physically bugged the monastery. The secret Vatican files, which only recently began leaking into historical record, reveal a campaign of absolute character assassination. The Holy Office officially accused Pio of being a fraud who manufactured his own miracles. They claimed he used carbolic acid and iodine to deliberately burn the flesh of his hands, chemically faking the stigmata to swindle vulnerable pilgrims out of millions of liras in donations. The paranoia extended into his absolute most private moments. The investigators planted hidden microphones directly into his austere monastic cell. The objective was deeply malicious. The Curia suspected that the friar's vow of chastity was a front, and they desperately hoped the audio feeds would capture the sounds of women sneaking into his quarters under the cover of darkness. They wanted a smoking gun to completely dismantle his saintly reputation. When the hidden microphones failed to produce a scandalous recording, the Vatican turned to outright psychological warfare. The Holy Office issued a crushing decree, placing Padre Pio under strict house arrest within his own monastery. For over a decade, he was officially banned from preaching to the public, forbidden from answering the millions of desperate letters sent to him, and barred from celebrating Mass outside a private, closed chapel. He was effectively buried alive inside the church he served. Yet, the more the Vatican tried to squeeze him, the more the institutional machinery fractured against his quiet defiance. Despite the relentless wiretaps, the constant surveillance and the coordinated smear campaigns, the Holy Office could never find their smoking gun. The audio tapes yielded nothing but hours of agonizing sighs, fervent rosary recitations, and the quiet weeping of broken sinners seeking absolution. Instead of catching a fraud, the Vatican's surveillance logs accidentally documented an impossible baseline of supernatural phenomena. While under the strict watch of papal spies, Pio continued to demonstrate abilities that defied physical law. He predicted the exact year of his own death down to the month. Decades before it happened, he looked at a young visiting Polish priest named Karol Wojtyła, and accurately foretold that he would one day ascend to the highest seat in Christendom as Pope John Paul II. Most chillingly of all, the physical evidence of his alleged fraud performed one final anomaly. On September 23, 1968, as Padre Pio drew his final breath, the deep bleeding stigmata wounds that had actively torn through his palms for exactly 50 years completely vanished. The skin closed up instantly, leaving no scars, no redness, and no anatomical trace that a wound had ever existed. In the end, the Vatican's spy ring suffered a total structural defeat. They couldn't break him, they couldn't expose him, and decades later, the Church was forced to do the one thing they fought for 50 years to avoid. They had to canonize him as a saint. Chapter 17. The Legend of Pope Joan. A grand, opulent papal procession winds slowly through the narrow, suffocatingly crowded cobblestone streets of medieval Rome. At the center of the spectacle rides the Pope, draped in heavy gold-embroidered silk vestments, sitting astride a pristine white horse. The air is thick with the scent of burning incense, the rhythmic tolling of cathedral bells, and the roaring cheers of the faithful who have packed the alleys to catch a glimpse of God's representative on earth. Suddenly, the cheers turn to gasps of horror. The Vicar of Christ slumps forward, slipping sideways off the leather saddle, and collapses violently onto the hard stone pavement. The inner circle of cardinals and Swiss guards rushes forward, shielding the fallen pontiff from the view of the surging crowd. They brace themselves for an assassination attempt, or a sudden fatal stroke brought on by the oppressive Italian heat. But as they lift the heavy layers of the papal robes to administer aid, the scene mutates from a medical emergency into something entirely surreal. The Pope is not dying from poison or a failing heart. Beneath the sacred vestments, the absolute leader of the Catholic Church is in active, agonizing labor and is currently giving birth to a child right there on the Appian Way, on the public stretch between the Colosseum and St. John Lateran. This shocking event forms the explosive core of one of the most enduring, paranoiac mysteries in religious history, the legend of Pope Joan. According to prominent 13th-century chroniclers like Jean de Mailly and Martin of Opava, this wasn't a fable manufactured to entertain the masses. It was a deeply buried, meticulously covered-up historical reality. The story states that in the 9th century, a brilliant Englishwoman named Joan realized that her gender permanently barred her from pursuing higher education, philosophy, and theological studies. Refusing to accept a life of forced domesticity, she chose to execute a high-stakes gamble. She disguised herself as a man, adopting the name John Anglicus, John of Mainz. Her disguise was flawless, and her intellect was unmatched. Her immense knowledge of scripture, mastery of classical languages, and sharp political maneuvering allowed her to quickly ascend through the rigid, deeply patriarchal bureaucratic ranks of the Roman Curia. She was eventually elected to the highest seat on earth, succeeding Pope Leo IV in 855 AD. The medieval chronicles claim her historic reign was violently cut short by her sudden pregnancy, which she had successfully hidden under loose flowing robes until that fateful day on the street. The accounts of her immediate fate vary wildly, adding a layer of Gothic horror to the mystery. Some texts state she died instantly on the cobblestones from severe medical complications during childbirth. Other, darker accounts claim she was instantly bound by her ankles to the tail of a wild horse, dragged through the dirt streets of Rome, and stoned to death by a deeply traumatized, furious mob of clergy and citizens. In the aftermath of the disaster, the Vatican allegedly launched an absolute campaign of historical erasure. Her name was systematically scrubbed from the Liber Pontificalis, the official book of popes. Her records were burned, and the papal procession route was permanently altered to bypass that exact street, leaving an intentional, quiet gap in the historical timeline. While the Church has dismissed the story as an absurd, anti-Catholic fairy tale for centuries, independent researchers point to a bizarre physical artifact hidden within the Vatican collections as potential evidence of an institutional defense mechanism designed to ensure this specific crisis could never happen again. This is the Cella Sterceraria, a real, ancient marble chair featuring a large distinct hole cut directly out of the center of the seat. According to historical lore, for generations following the Pope Joan disaster, every newly elected pontiff was forced to undergo a mandatory, highly unusual anatomical examination before their coronation could be finalized. The president-elect would sit upon the open-bottomed marble chair, while a young deacon reached beneath the seat to visually and physically verify the candidate's anatomy. Once confirmed, the deacon would turn to the gathered assembly of cardinals and loudly proclaim the ritual Latin phrase, duos habet, et bene pendent. He has two, and they hang well. Only after this declaration was made could the triple tiara be safely placed upon the new pope's head, guaranteeing the gender purity of the throne. To evaluate this historical cold case, modern investigators must weigh the physical artifacts against the surviving text records. The evidence remains deeply divided between institutional ritual and medieval political theatre. When we look at the case with a modern investigative eye, historians generally categorize the tale of Pope Joan as a highly effective piece of medieval political satire. It was a weaponized narrative, likely manufactured by anti-papal critics or Protestant reformers centuries later to mock the perceived weakness, spiritual vulnerability, and internal corruption of the Roman Curia. In a dark age defined by absolute public illiteracy, isolated scriptoriums, and manually forged records, information was entirely centralized. If a brilliant woman did manage to hide her identity beneath a set of loose flowing robes, the institutional machine possessed the absolute power to completely rewrite the past. If the Vatican decided a pope never existed, they could make them vanish from the memory of the world with the stroke of a single ink-dipped quill. Chapter 18, Corruption, Betrayal, and the Fall of a Pope, January 2012. The private apartments of the Apostolic Palace are dead silent. Inside the inner sanctum of the Vatican, a quiet, unassuming man named Paolo Gabriele moves like a shadow through the dark rooms. Gabriele isn't an outside intruder or a foreign state intelligence operative. He occupies the ultimate sacred position of trust within the Catholic hierarchy. He is the personal butler to Pope Benedict XVI. He is one of a tiny handful of human beings on the planet who holds a physical key to the Holy Father's private desk. But as the elderly Pope sleeps in the adjacent bedroom, Gabriele isn't preparing the pontiff's morning vestments. Instead, he pulls a high-speed portable digital scanner from his jacket. Working with surgical precision, he begins feeding highly confidential, encrypted papal memos, private bank statements and personal letters from the Pope's desk through the scanner. The machine buzzes softly in the dark. Gabriele systematically stuffs the printed copies into a leather briefcase, preparing to smuggle them past the Swiss Guard and directly into the hands of investigative journalists. The modern digital age was about to collide head-on with the world's most secretive institution. The subsequent information dump, weaponized under the media headline Vati Leaks, tore back the pristine curtain of holiness to reveal a chaotic, cutthroat corporate battlefield. The leaked documents didn't just expose minor administrative errors, they exposed a systematic, deep-seated culture of internal corruption, corporate espionage, and financial malfeasance that reached into the absolute highest echelons of the Holy See. The content of the stolen papers read like a paranoiac political thriller. They detailed widespread, untaxed money laundering operations flowing through the Institute for Works of Religion, commonly known as the Vatican Bank. They illuminated the existence of highly organized blackmail networks operated by senior prelates, who used sensitive personal information to stall career advancements and control institutional policy. Most chillingly of all, the documents exposed internal power struggles so severe they verged on physical violence. One high-profile leaked letter, sent directly to Pope Benedict by a prominent archbishop named Carlo Maria Vigano, blew the whistle on massive financial fraud in Vatican contract bidding. Vigano warned the Pope that his life was in immediate danger. Subsequent memos even detailed an explicit internal plot to poison Benedict XVI within 12 months if he did not cease his direct investigations into the bank's secret accounts. As the scandalous headlines dominated international news feeds, the Vatican Gendarmerie, the state's sovereign police force, launched a furious, desperate internal mole hunt. The forensic trail led straight to the Pope's own doorstep. Detectives raided Paolo Gabriele's private apartment, located inside the secure walls of the Vatican. What they discovered went far beyond a few leaked files. Investigators unearthed 82 massive cardboard boxes overflowing with classified papal documents, advanced digital storage drives, stolen gold nuggets, and a forged, uncashed check for €100,000 addressed directly to the Pope himself. Gabriele was promptly arrested, convicted of aggravated theft by a Vatican tribunal, and locked inside a secure holding cell. He claimed he acted purely out of spiritual love, arguing that the gentle, academic Pope Benedict was being completely manipulated and blinded by his corrupt handlers, and that only a massive public shock could save the Church from its own shadow state. The whistleblower was silenced, but the structural damage to the papacy was absolute and irreversible. Pope Benedict XVI, a brilliant but frail theologian, found himself completely overwhelmed by the unmanageable scale of the internal corruption, the relentless corporate warfare, and his own rapidly failing physical health. He realized he no longer possessed the raw physical or psychological stamina required to purge the machine. On February 11, 2013, Benedict stepped up to a microphone and read a brief statement in formal Latin that sent shockwaves across the globe. He was voluntarily abdicating the throne. It was a historic anomaly that hadn't occurred in nearly 600 years, since Pope Gregory XII resigned in 1415 to heal the Western Schism. This historic surrender proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the darkest, most terrifying secrets of the Vatican aren't just dead parchment artifacts locked safely inside ancient subterranean vaults. They are alive, volatile, and dangerous digital currents actively capable of toppling the modern throne today. Chapter 19. The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara. June 23rd, 1858. Bologna, Italy. The Papal States. In the mid-19th century, the Vatican wasn't just a sovereign city block in Rome. It was an absolute monarchy ruling over vast swaths of Italy with an iron fist wrapped in ancient scripture. In the Jewish quarter of Bologna, the Mortara home is completely dark. Momolo Mortara, a merchant, sleeps soundly alongside his wife Mariana and their 8 children. The transition from peaceful domesticity to state-sanctioned nightmare occurs in a fraction of a second. Marshal Lucidi of the Papal Gendarmerie stands on the threshold, flanked by armed guards. They carry a direct, unappealable warrant issued by the Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Roman and Universal Inquisition, the modern incarnation of the Holy Office. They don't search for contraband. They don't look for stolen money. They march directly into the nursery, pinpointing 6-year-old Edgardo Mortara. As Mariana screams, throwing her body over her child, the guards violently grab the boy from her arms. No formal charges are read. No explanation is given on the dimly lit street. The child is shoved into a covered carriage that vanishes into the night, leaving a shattered family behind. To understand how a sovereign government could legally kidnap a child from a tax-paying family, we have to examine the bureaucratic anatomy of absolute religious law. This is where the case file uncovers its most chilling loophole, a forensic anomaly born from an illiterate servant's panic. Years prior, the Mortaras had employed a 14-year-old Catholic servant girl named Anna Marissi. When Edgardo was a mere infant, he contracted a severe illness that left him bedridden and shivering with fever. Anna, thoroughly conditioned by local priests, grew terrified that the baby was going to die. In her mind, an unbaptized Jewish child passing away meant an eternity of agonizing torment in hell. Acting entirely in secret, she scooped a handful of ordinary tap water, sprinkled it over the sweating forehead of the sleeping infant, and muttered the basic Catholic baptismal formula. Edgardo recovered. Anna kept her secret for years, until a subsequent conversation with a priest slipped the detail out. Under the strict immutable framework of canon law, the moment that tap water touched Edgardo's skin, a cosmic permanent transformation occurred. He was no longer legally or spiritually Jewish. He was, in the unyielding eyes of the Vatican, a validly baptized Roman Catholic. Furthermore, papal law dictated an absolute, terrifying mandate. A Catholic child could not, under any circumstances, be raised by infidels or non-Christians. The state machine viewed the kidnapping not as a crime, but as a mandatory rescue operation to protect a Catholic soul from a Jewish home. Edgardo was immediately smuggled out of Bologna under armed escort, flying down the dirt roads toward Rome. He was placed inside the House of Catechumens, a Vatican institution specifically engineered for the forced conversion of Jews and Muslims. There, Pope Pius IX didn't just oversee the case from afar. He effectively adopted the 6-year-old boy as a high-profile personal project. But the Vatican underestimated the modern world. By 1858, the Telegraph and the international press had turned local events into global scandals. The Mortara kidnapping triggered an unprecedented international proxy war. The wealthy Rothschild banking dynasty, horrified by the systemic extremism, threatened to completely freeze the Vatican's international credit lines. In Paris, Emperor Napoleon III, whose military troops were actively protecting the Pope from Italian revolutionaries, sent furious, explicit diplomatic warnings stating that French public opinion could no longer tolerate supporting a medieval theocracy that stole children. The global elite demanded the boy's immediate return. Pope Pius IX looked out at the world's empires and offered a chilling 2-word response that would define his papacy: non possumus, we cannot. Behind the high stone walls of the Vatican, a calculated psychological re-engineering was underway. The boy was isolated from everything he knew. His parents were occasionally permitted to visit, but they were strictly barred from touching or kissing him unless they agreed to instantly convert to Catholicism. Edgardo was forced to sit at the Pope's feet during audiences, wrapped in the pontiff's own white robes, completely hidden from the world. This true crime file doesn't end with a daring rescue or a triumphant return. It ends with a psychological twist that highlights the terrifying efficacy of systemic assimilation. Edgardo Mortara was completely erased from within. Over years of isolation, constant theological drilling, and the replacement of his biological father with the Pope himself, the boy developed a profound case of institutional Stockholm syndrome. He didn't just accept his new identity, he weaponized it. By the time he reached adulthood, Edgardo had been ordained as a Catholic priest. taking the name Father Pio Maria in honor of the Pope who had ordered his abduction. The final heartbreaking clue to his total transformation arrived in September 1870, as Italian revolutionary forces stormed the walls of Rome to strip the Pope of his temporal power and unify Italy. A teenager Gardo did not run toward his liberation. Instead, he physically threw himself onto the barricades, attempting to defend his papal captor from the liberating soldiers. He spent the remainder of his long life traveling across Europe as an aggressive missionary, utilizing his tragic story to target and try to convert his own surviving, deeply traumatized Jewish relatives. He died in a Belgian monastery in 1940, completely loyal to the system that had stolen his life from the nursery. Chapter 20. The Vatican's Role in the Holocaust. March 2, 2020. Rome, Italy. The unyielding doors of the Vatican Apostolic Archives are unlocked. Under direct orders from the Pope, decades of absolute secrecy are peeled away as the wartime files of Pope Pius XII are officially declassified. Hundreds of international historians, clad in white archival gloves, descend into the subterranean vaults. They are hunting for a paper trail left in the wake of the 20th century's greatest industrial slaughter. Deep within the unindexed boxes, an investigator pulls out a standard yellowed index card. The document originally belonged to a bureaucracy meant to manage post-war refugee relief. But as the ink is passed, a terrifying anomaly emerges. The card details a fabricated identity for a high-profile fugitive. Stamped directly over it is an official transit visa, a clean biographical history, and a Red Cross passport funded by a Vatican charity. This was no administrative oversight. It was an official piece of statecraft used to rescue an infamous SS mass murderer from the gallows of Nuremberg. The declassification of these files exposes the clinical inner workings of the rat lines, a network of escape routes that allowed thousands of Nazi war criminals to slip out of devastated Europe and evade international justice. At the center of this web stood a sovereign sanctuary, Rome. The historical investigation points directly to a high-ranking Austrian cleric in the Holy See, Bishop Alois Hudel. Operating out of the Santa Maria dell'Anima monastery, Hudel acted as a travel agent for the damned. He did not hide his actions from his superiors. He institutionalized them. The operational data retrieved from the declassified dossier maps out a highly efficient, multi-tiered pipeline. Local Roman monasteries systematically generated falsified parish birth certificates, retroactively transforming German SS officers into stateless refugees. The Vatican Refugee Migration Bureau utilized these forged documents to secure Red Cross humanitarian identity cards, bypassing Allied military screening. High-ranking sympathetic prelates provided cash stipends for transatlantic passage directly to the fugitives. Through this bureaucratic conveyor belt, some of the most monstrous architects of the Holocaust walked free. Adolf Eichmann, the logistical mastermind of the final solution, utilized a Vatican-secured passport under the alias Ricardo Clement to flee to Argentina. Josef Mengele, who conducted horrific human experiments at Auschwitz, dissolved into shadows via this Roman pipeline. Franz Stangl, the commandant of the Treblinka extermination camp, walked into Rome a wanted mass murderer and walked out with a ticket to South America, later dryly noting that Bishop Hudal had personally arranged his safe passage. This brings the investigation directly to the apex of the hierarchy. Pope Pius XII. For decades, the narrative surrounding the wartime pontiff has been trapped between two extremes: a secret fascist sympathizer or a terrified bureaucrat playing a lethal game of chess. The declassified data suggests a far more calculated clinical reality. Pius XII was a master diplomat whose overriding strategy was dictated by a chilling geopolitical calculus. To the Vatican, the primary existential threat to global Christianity was not Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, it was Joseph Stalin's Soviet communism. Leaked diplomatic memos show that the Holy See viewed Nazism as a temporary volatile madness that would eventually burn itself out. Bolshevism, however, was an atheistic ideological virus capable of permanently erasing the Church from Europe. By maintaining an absolute stance of diplomatic neutrality, Pius XII turned the Holy See into a silent bystander to history. He consistently ignored desperate classified intelligence briefs sent by Allied nations detailing the exact mechanics of the death camps. He refused to publicly excommunicate Adolf Hitler, who remained a baptized Catholic until his death, and chose not to issue a singular, explicit papal encyclical denouncing the genocide. Silence was weaponized as a strategic shield to protect the institutional infrastructure of the Church. The dossier closes on a note of lingering, industrial coldness. The mystery of the Vatican's role in the Holocaust is not a failure of information, but a revelation of institutional priority. The very apparatus that held the moral ledger of the Western world permitted its sovereign diplomatic channels, its sacred monasteries, and its financial reserves to be converted into a shield for monsters. The paper trail remains unbroken, preserved in the climate-controlled vaults of Rome, an indelible ink-stained scar permanently etched into the stone walls of the Apostolic Palace. Chapter 21. The Palmar de Troya Cult. Deep within the sun-baked, dusty plains of Andalusia, Spain, stands an architectural anomaly that looks like a dystopian military fortress cross-pollinated with a medieval cathedral. Encircled by towering concrete walls, spiked iron gates, and high-definition surveillance arrays, the Holy Apostolic Catholic Palmarian Church operates as a literal shadow state. To the casual observer, it seems like a relic of an ancient world, but step inside, and you enter one of the most secretive, wealthy, and deeply unsettling splinter cults on the planet. This is the story of the Palmar de Troya cult, a group that didn't just break away from Rome, but built a mirror universe complete with its own apocalyptic doctrines, armed security, and a succession of self-proclaimed anti-popes. The genesis of this dark spiritual empire traced back to March 1968, when 4 young schoolgirls claimed to have witnessed an apparition of the Virgin Mary on a hill near the village of El Palmar de Troya. While the local Catholic diocese dismissed the claims, the site quickly became a magnet for extreme traditionalist Catholics who were deeply angry about the modernizing reforms of the Vatican's Second Ecumenical Council. Amidst the chaos of ecstatic crowds and mass hysteria, a young charismatic insurance clerk from Seville named Clemente Dominguez y Gomez stepped into the spotlight. Clemente didn't just claim to see the Virgin Mary, he claimed to receive direct violent physical stigmata and apocalyptic dictates from Jesus Christ himself. His visions grew increasingly dark, paranoid, and megalomaniacal, shifting the focus of the apparitions from spiritual devotion to a total war against the modern world. Clemente's power consolidated rapidly through a bizarre combination of tragedy and opportunistic maneuvering. In 1976, a horrific car crash tore through his vehicle, leaving him permanently blind after both of his eyes were surgically removed. Rather than breaking his influence, this physical disfigurement cemented his mystique. His followers viewed his empty eye sockets as proof that he had traded his earthly sight for unmediated divine cosmic vision. Recognizing his growing financial and psychological leverage over a wealthy network of global donors, a rogue, ultra-conservative Vietnamese archbishop named Pierre Martin Ngoc Thuc traveled to Spain and unlawfully ordained Clemente as a bishop, giving the cult the legitimate apostolic succession it desperately needed to wage a war of legitimacy against Rome. The true fracture occurred in August 1978 upon the death of Pope Paul VI. While the cardinals in Rome gathered in a secret conclave to elect a successor, Clemente claimed that Jesus Christ had personally materialized in a vision in Bogotá, Colombia, and crowned him directly as the true Pope of the Catholic Church. Taking the papal name Pope Gregory XVII, Clemente declared that the College of Cardinals in Rome had officially excommunicated themselves by falling into heresy, and that the true Holy See had mystically migrated to the dusty field in Spain. What followed was a descent into a surreal, totalitarian theological nightmare. Operating from his newly constructed fortress cathedral, Pope Gregory XVII began radically rewriting Christian history and theology. He completely restructured the Catholic calendar and initiated a series of jaw-dropping canonizations that horrified mainstream historians. Under the infallibility of the Palmarian chair, the cult officially elevated brutal fascist dictators to the status of heavenly saints, most notably Generalissimo Francisco Franco and, most chillingly, Adolf Hitler. In the Palmarian narrative, these figures were celebrated as holy crusaders who had defended the purity of the faith against the modern plagues of communism, democracy, and secularism, effectively turning their altars into a dark pantheon of authoritarian worship. As the decades rolled on, the Palmar de Troya cult mutated from an eccentric theological schism into a highly controlling, paranoid prison state. The cult implemented a system of absolute psychological isolation designed to systematically break the autonomy of its members. Under strict Palmarian law, followers are completely forbidden from watching films, listening to secular music, reading newspapers, or voting in public elections. The dress code is aggressively enforced. Women must wear floor-length habits at all times, and men are barred from wearing short sleeves. Most devastatingly of all, members are strictly prohibited from speaking, interacting, or even making eye contact with anyone who is not a baptized Palmarian, a rule that has permanently shattered thousands of families, forcing parents to completely abandon their children and siblings to treat each other as dead souls if they choose to leave the compound. Despite decades of internal financial scandals, mysterious deaths, and the shocking defection of subsequent Palmarian popes who ran away with the cult's money to get married, this shadow Vatican continues to thrive in absolute secrecy today. funded by a global network of wealthy, deeply isolated traditionalists who funnel millions of dollars into the compound through hidden trusts and real estate holdings. The fortress at Palmar de Troya remains completely impenetrable to outside investigators. It stands as a chilling monument to how easily the human desire for spiritual certainty can be weaponized into an absolute, militaristic apparatus of psychological slavery. The Palmarian schism proves that when individuals entirely surrender their critical thinking to a self-proclaimed prophet, a simple field can transform into a fortress of absolute control. It stands as a testament to the terrifying reality that the structures of faith can be easily inverted to build a sovereign empire of psychological isolation. But as we leave the guarded walls of Spain's parallel papacy behind, we must descend even further into the shadows to confront the Vatican's most terrifying, hands-on administrative protocol, the clinical, secret ritual of hunting literal demons. Chapter 22, Exorcisms, Demonic Possession, and the Vatican's Secret Rituals. It was the year 1676. Deep within the claustrophobic stone walls of the Palma di Montechiaro convent in Sicily, the quiet sanctuary of a cloistered life was about to be permanently shattered. A 21-year-old nun, known as Sister Maria Crocifissa della Concezione, collapsed onto the freezing granite floor of her cell. When she finally opened her eyes hours later, her fingers were stained pitch black with heavy ink, and sitting on the wooden table right in front of her lay a manuscript written in an entirely unrecognizable, chaotic script. Sister Maria claimed that Lucifer himself had physically seized her motor nervous system, forcing her hand to scratch out a message explicitly designed to turn humanity completely away from God. For more than 300 years, this document remained one of the most heavily guarded, deeply unsettling cryptographic mysteries in religious history. It was an absolute cipher, a manic, intricate web blending ancient Greek, Arabic, Latin, and runic alphabets that completely defied the world's most brilliant historical cryptographers. Then came 2017. A team of software engineers decided to tackle the manuscript using an advanced decryption algorithm they sourced directly from the deep web, a program originally engineered by intelligence agencies to pass highly secure, non-linear communications. When the algorithm finally cracked the matrix of the 1676 code, the translated text didn't reveal a rambling mess of madness. Instead, what the researchers uncovered unleashed a wave of profound academic dread. The document was a highly sophisticated, chillingly coherent, and deeply nihilistic philosophical treatise, arguing that God was a mere invention of human insecurity. But what left secular researchers genuinely disturbed was the sheer structural impossibility of the event. Think about it for a second. How does a completely isolated, semi-literate 17th-century nun spontaneously synthesize a flawless, cross-linguistic cryptographic matrix overnight? Without help, constructing a code this complex is an extraordinary feat. A feat that, given the context, simply doesn't add up. To combat this exact brand of anomalous psychological contamination, the modern Vatican doesn't rely on medieval superstitions or dramatic rituals. Instead, they have completely institutionalized the warfare. If you travel to Rome today, you can find the campus of the Athenaeum Pontificium Regini Apostolorum. It's a highly secure, accredited pontifical university, and behind its closed doors, the church hosts a specialized, highly restricted course titled Exorcism and Prayers of Liberation. This isn't a gathering of fanatical zealots. This is a sterile, academic assembly where tactical priests sit shoulder to shoulder with certified secular psychiatrists, criminologists, and neuroscientists. The Vatican explicitly invites these medical professionals to lecture, creating an uneasy administrative alliance between the spiritual and the empirical. The curriculum focuses heavily on an aggressive clinical screening protocol designed to identify and filter out ordinary psychological anomalies. Students are taught that roughly 99% of all reported demonic manifestations are actually severe, misdiagnosed cases of acute Tourette syndrome, paranoia, or advanced antisocial dissociative disorders. But the true institutional dread begins in that remaining 1%. That razor-thin margin represents the cases where the global medical establishment formally throws up its hands. Incidents where antipsychotic medications fail to flatline the symptoms, where brain scans show zero neurological irregularities, and where the human organism begins behaving in ways that actively violate known biological frameworks. The internal panic surrounding this unexplained 1% reached a critical tipping point in 1999. Prompting the Vatican to officially update its Universal Exorcism Manual, the Rituali Romanum, for the first time since 1614. On the surface, the update introduced thick layers of bureaucratic red tape requiring written psychiatric clearance and explicit permission from a bishop before any ritual could begin. However, leaked whistleblower logs from deep within the Roman Curia suggest a far more calculated defensive strategy. The new regulations weren't just about safety. They were a deliberate attempt to centralize data and suppress a terrifying reality. Today, the Vatican quietly maintains an entirely air-gapped, heavily encrypted digital registry dedicated exclusively to these unsolved spiritual manifestations. Within this digital vault lies a heavily redacted case file tracking a localized spatial anomaly during a sanctioned modern ritual. To eliminate human bias, independent investigators had rigged the room with multiple high-speed, military-grade digital cameras and electromagnetic field sensors. The exact millisecond the exorcist initiated the ancient Latin formulas, something impossible happened. Every single camera experienced a simultaneous catastrophic hardware failure. Their digital memory cards were completely corrupted by an unexplainable, highly localized magnetic pulse. At the exact same time, the sensors recorded a localized drop in atmospheric pressure and temperature that entirely defied the laws of thermodynamics, leaving behind hard data but zero conventional explanations. The true terror of the modern Vatican's exorcism protocol lies not in ancient, dusty superstitions, but in its cold, clinical, bureaucratic evolution. By converting the warfare against unseen malevolence into an air-gapped, data-driven counterintelligence operation, Rome ensures that the most terrifying anomalies of human contamination remain completely classified. Everything about this conflicts with the reality of the situation we've been given. No matter which way you approach it, nothing makes sense without drawing vectors to things that shouldn't exist. And to me, that's what makes this institutional secrecy so incredibly perplexing. But as we slip past the tactical priests and their encrypted registries, we must prepare to confront an even older, more systemic secret written into the very architecture of Rome. The Vatican's hidden, symbiotic relationship with the ancient occult. Chapter 23. The Vatican and the Occult. Hidden Symbols and Forbidden Knowledge. February 17th, 1600. The atmosphere in the Campo de' Fiori Square in Rome is suffocating. A restless crowd packs the cobblestone marketplace, pressing against heavy wooden barricades under the watchful eyes of hooded inquisitors. At the center of it all stands Giordano Bruno, a brilliant Dominican friar, philosopher, and mathematician. He is stripped entirely naked, bound tightly to a wooden stake, and surrounded by a mountain of dry kindling. But right before the fire is lit, the executioners do something incredibly specific. They take a heavy metal spike and drive it straight through Bruno's tongue, locking his jaws into an agonizing silent iron vice. The Holy Office didn't just want to execute his body, they needed to permanently silence his voice. They had to make absolutely sure he couldn't utter a single prophetic word to the onlookers below. The mainstream historical narrative tells us that Bruno was burned at the stake simply because he claimed the universe was infinite. They say he was martyred for early scientific theories, proposing that distant stars were just other suns orbited by their own planets. But when you start to dig into the heavily guarded trial records of the Inquisition, a completely different story begins to emerge. Bruno's real crime wasn't a passion for astronomy. There was something far more dangerous to the structure of the church. You see, Bruno had cracked an encrypted forbidden code. He had successfully mapped an intricate matrix connecting traditional Christian theology directly to ancient Egyptian Hermeticism, the lost esoteric magical formulas of the Nile. To the Vatican, this wasn't just heresy. It was a systematic leak of high-level spiritual secrets that threatened their entire monopoly on the divine. They burned the man, but they couldn't burn the mathematics. If you look past the bloody execution squares and shift your focus directly to the modern geography of the Vatican itself, you find something completely unexpected. Bruno's forbidden cosmic code wasn't wiped out of history. Instead, it was quietly absorbed, translated, and written directly into the very architecture of Rome. Let's take a closer look at St. Peter's Square, designed by the master architect Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Millions of pilgrims gather here every year, believing they are standing in the ultimate sanctuary of the Catholic faith. But if you strip away the traditional Baroque art and perform an objective, structural decryption of the layout, a completely different reality materializes. This isn't just a public square, it's a massive, meticulously calculated occult talisman cut straight into the earth. Think about the geometry for a second. When you look at St. Peter's Square from a precise aerial viewpoint, the towering Doric colonnades don't just look like welcoming arms. They form a perfect, unmistakable giant keyhole shape. In classical esoteric tradition, the keyhole is a highly specific geometric symbol. It doesn't represent an open door for the masses. It represents the containment of secret forces and the unlocking of forbidden cosmic realms. And right at the exact mathematical center of this massive keyhole stands what is known as the solar needle. It's a colossal, 300-ton ancient Egyptian obelisk, carved from a single block of red granite. The church tells you it's a monument to the triumph of Christianity over paganism. But look at how it actually functions. This monolith was originally erected in Heliopolis thousands of years ago, explicitly dedicated to the sun god Ra. Bernini didn't just place it there for decoration. It acts as a monumental astronomical sundial. As the sun moves across the Italian sky, the tip of this pagan obelisk casts a sharp shifting shadow that crawls across a hidden zodiac wheel, embedded directly into the cobblestones below. A giant solar clock, mapping the movements of pagan constellations, sitting at the absolute heart of Western Christianity. Something here doesn't add up. This calculated blending of the sacred and the profane isn't just limited to the stone architecture outside. It goes much deeper, winding down into the most restricted subterranean vaults of the Vatican secret archives, the Bibliotheca. During the brutal centuries of the Inquisition, church operatives didn't just hunt down heretics. They systematically intercepted and confiscated thousands of occult manuals, hidden Gnostic scrolls, and deeply secretive Kabbalistic grimoires from across the known world. They gathered these ancient volumes with a military-grade precision that bordered on absolute obsession. Now ask yourself a simple question. If an institution truly believed that magic, sorcery, and occult rituals were nothing but fake, childish superstitions, what would they do with those books? They would burn them. They would destroy the papers to prove they had no power. But the archives tell us they did the exact opposite. The church didn't destroy these texts. They carefully catalogued them, preserved them in climate-controlled underground rooms, and placed them under absolute air-gapped security. Why? Because they believed the magical formulas, the hidden geometric equations, and the forbidden spiritual physics contained within those parchment pages were intensely, dangerously real. By hiding them away from the public, the Vatican successfully engineered a total, global monopoly on the esoteric. They understood that the ultimate form of power isn't just gold or armies, it's the absolute control over the hidden mechanisms of reality itself. When you piece all of these fragments together, you are left with a profoundly unsettling realization. The very same institutional machine that spent generations torturing independent occultists, hanging suspected witches, and driving iron spikes through the tongues of rogue philosophers built its own world headquarters using the exact architectural, astrological, and geometric frameworks of high-level occult ritualism. They weaponized the symbols of the ancient world while keeping the keys entirely to themselves. The shadow cast by the Egyptian obelisk remains a silent, unbroken record of an ancient, secret blueprint. A blueprint laid out in stone, ink, and blood. Chapter 24. The Vatican's Secret Knowledge of Extraterrestrials. Late in the evening of April 15, 1954, the peaceful atmosphere at Castel Gandolfo, the private papal summer residence outside Rome, completely dissolved. Pope Pius XII stood entirely alone on his stone balcony, staring out over the dark, reflective waters of Lake Albano. According to personal logs later recovered from the private estate, the Pope wasn't looking at the stars. He was watching a silent, highly luminous aerodynamic object hovering perfectly still just a few hundred feet above the gardens. The object didn't possess any visible engines, and it made absolutely no sound. It was a solid metallic sphere that slowly began to rotate on its own axis, emitting a faint rhythmic pulse of indigo light that completely neutralized the surrounding electrical grid. The Swiss guard on duty were ordered to stand down, lock the perimeter gates, and maintain absolute radio silence. For decades, the Vatican dismissed this event as a series of stress-induced hallucinations suffered by an aging pontiff. But the real horror surfaced years later through the leaked personal diary of the Pope's controversial private physician, Dr. Riccardo Galeazzi Lisi. Dr. Riccardo recorded that immediately following that specific night, the Pope began exhibiting bizarre, unexplained physiological anomalies. His body temperature dropped significantly below normal biological limits for hours at a time, and his eyes suffered from acute retinal scarring, the exact type of cellular degradation caused by looking directly at high-intensity non-solar radiation. The doctor noted that Pius XII spent his remaining nights frantically transcribing strings of nonlinear geometric sequences, claiming they were being broadcast directly into his conscious mind by what he called the engineers of the sky. To understand what the Vatican was actually tracking, we have to look past the official cover stories and dive straight into a highly classified section of the Vatican's secret archives, known exclusively as Fondo Special Archivi Notturni, the special fund of the night archives. Buried within these climate-controlled vaults lies the unredacted dossier on the infamous 1917 Fatima incident. The mainstream world knows it as a religious miracle where 70,000 people witnessed the sun dance in the sky. But the internal multidisciplinary intelligence report compiled by the Holy Office tells a far more terrifying story. The original, raw testimonies of the children were confiscated and replaced with sanitized spiritual narratives. The unredacted field files describe the object not as a divine light, but as a dull silver disc-shaped craft that emitted a metallic humming frequency, so intense it caused localized nausea, temporary blindness, and radiation burns among the closest onlookers. More disturbingly, the dossier contains a detailed analysis of the entity that supposedly emerged from the craft. The children didn't describe a holy figure. They described a small, completely hairless, translucent biological entity, whose thoughts were transmitted not through human speech, but through an invasive high-frequency auditory buzz that bypassed the ears entirely, vibrating directly inside the frontal lobe of the skull. The Vatican realized early on that these manifestations weren't spiritual. They were physical, highly advanced, and completely indifferent to human structures. This realization triggered a massive silent mobilization within the highest echelons of the priesthood. In the late 1970s, under a cover of darkness and complete bureaucratic anonymity, a specialized team of Jesuit cryptologists and linguistic experts was deployed to a secure underground facility located beneath the Cortile del Belvedere. Their sole directive was to cross-reference these modern cosmic contact reports with the Church's most restricted, pre-biblical texts, specifically the fragments of the apocryphal Book of Enoch that were explicitly excluded from the canonical Bible. What they discovered sent a wave of cold panic through the inner circle of the Roman Curia. The ancient texts didn't describe gods or angels. They contained an intricate mathematical countdown matrix. The glyphs and astronomical coordinates left behind by these ancient non-human entities weren't prophecies, they were operational schedules. The Vatican realized that the entities who had intervened in human history thousands of years ago had left behind a highly precise timeline for their eventual return. Today, the security surrounding this cosmic data has reached an unprecedented level of absolute paranoia. Security guards monitoring the deep subterranean corridors beneath the Vatican's secret archives have reported a series of highly classified, localized anomalies that the hierarchy refuses to officially acknowledge. Entire hallways are occasionally sealed off under the guise of routine structural maintenance, but whistleblowers within the gendarmerie reveal that the security cameras in those sectors consistently record terrifying distortions. The digital feeds show shadows that move independently against the stone walls, elongating and shifting even when there is no physical human presence or moving light source in the corridor. Motion sensors trigger in completely locked, air-gapped vaults, recording footsteps that leave zero heat signatures on thermal tracking systems. The Vatican isn't running an astronomical research operation out of an innocent desire to explore the universe. They aren't staring into the deep void to find out if life exists beyond Earth. They have known the truth for centuries. They are keeping the files locked, the data encrypted, and the public completely blind because they are staring directly at a ticking clock. They know exactly who is coming back, they know exactly what they want, and they know that when the sky finally opens, the entire illusion of human sovereignty will evaporate in an instant. Chapter 25. The Klingenberg Tapes. The True Story of Emily Rose. Inside a dimly lit, silent courtroom in Aschaffenburg, Bavaria. The year is 1978. A judge leans forward and presses down on the heavy plastic button of a vintage reel-to-reel tape recorder. The magnetic tape begins to spin with a rhythmic, mechanical clack-whir. At first, there is only a low-frequency analog hum filling the room, punctuated by sudden sharp bursts of harsh white noise. Then the audio catches. Out of the speakers blasts a distorted multitonal growl, a sound so deeply guttural, aggressive, and non-human that it sends an immediate wave of cold sweat through the jury. This isn't a special effect from a Hollywood studio. This is the raw, unedited voice of Anneliese Michel, the real-life university student whose agonizing demise inspired the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose. Before the tapes captured her screaming in ancient tongues, Anneliese was a bright, deeply religious 20-year-old girl living in a conservative German village in the early 1970s. Her life seemed completely normal, until a sudden, invisible switch flipped inside her neurology. Without warning, she was struck down by violent nocturnal seizures and periods of total, agonizing full-body paralysis. But it was what happened when she was awake that truly terrified her family. Anneliese began experiencing horrific visual hallucinations. She claimed that dark, twisted entities, which she called fratzen, or demonic grimacing faces, were manifesting out of the shadows of her bedroom, staring at her with unblinking eyes. Medical professionals immediately stepped in, diagnosing her with severe temporal lobe epilepsy combined with acute schizophrenia-grade psychosis. They aggressively treated her with advanced anticonvulsant drugs like Tegretol. But here is where the case takes a profoundly unsettling turn. The modern medicine did absolutely nothing to stop the visions. Instead, her behavior fractured into a reality so violently anomalous, it defied every clinical textbook. Anneliese began rejecting all religious objects, smashing crucifixes on sight. She was observed dropping to the stone floor of her home to lick her own pooled urine. She began chewing on raw pieces of coal, pulling dead spiders off the walls to eat them, and systematically catching birds just to bite their heads off. As secular science completely failed to contain the madness, a dark transition occurred. Medicine stepped back, and the oldest hierarchy in the world stepped directly into the room. In 1975, Bishop Joseph Stangl officially authorized a highly secretive medieval mandate, the Rituali Romanum decree of exorcism. The case was handed over to two deeply traditional clergymen, Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Alt. This wasn't a brief symbolic prayer session hidden away from public view. This was a systematic 10-month campaign of absolute psychological and physical attrition. For nearly a year, the priests transformed the girl's small, claustrophobic bedroom into an active spiritual battleground. They subjected the fragile 23-year-old to 67 distinct exorcism sessions. Each single ritual lasted up to 4 agonizing hours, pushing her mind and body past the absolute breaking point. As the months dragged on, the priests brought an analog tape recorder into the room, capturing over 42 hours of highly disturbing audio evidence. The tapes reveal an absolute descent into madness. When the priests demanded the entities name themselves, the voice coming out of Anneliese didn't claim a single identity. It asserted it was a collective demonic matrix consisting of 6 infamous historical figures: Lucifer, Judas Iscariot, Nero, Cain, Fleischmann, a disgraced Frankish priest, and Adolf Hitler. The physical degradation inside that room was horrific. Driven by an unnatural manic energy, Anneliese would perform up to 600 ritual genuflections a day. The repetitive, high-impact force completely shattered her knee joints and tore her tendons apart, leaving her unable to walk without assistance. "I am nothing but dirt," the voice on the tape rasped. "You must not look at me." Worse still, she completely refused all food and water. She claimed that the others in her mind would physically lock her throat if she tried to swallow, preventing her from taking any nourishment. Rather than seeking emergency hospitalization or calling for a medical feeding tube, the priests continued the grueling rituals day after day, documenting her physical collapse while her weight plummeted to a skeletal 68 pounds. The end finally came on the morning of July 1st, 1976. Racked by extreme starvation, total dehydration, and a high-grade fever that made her skin boiling hot to the touch, her body simply gave out. Her very last words, whispered in a fragile breath to her mother, were a haunting plea: "Mama, I'm afraid." But this dark story doesn't end with a quiet spiritual ascension or a tidy religious mystery. Instead, it ends with the cold, heavy slam of a secular gavel. The state of Germany stepped in and charged both Father Renz, Father Alt, and Anneliese's own parents with negligent homicide. The ensuing 1978 trial forced a spectacular head-on collision between modern forensic science and ancient theological belief. The defense played the terrifying guttural audio tapes in open court, arguing that the possession was a tangible reality and that her soul was saved through the rituals. But the prosecution fired back with a brutal, undeniable forensic truth. Anneliese was not a monster, she was a dying girl. A simple medical intervention just 1 week prior to her death would have saved her life. The court agreed, finding all parties guilty. But while the modern church fought to hide the audio tapes of a dying girl in Bavaria, centuries earlier, the supreme leader of the Vatican was turning the entire Holy See into a literal house of sin. Chapter 26. Pope John XII's Brothel. Step inside the historic Lateran Palace in Rome. The year is 955 AD. This isn't a place of solemn prayer, soft candlelight, or quiet spiritual reflection. Instead, the heavy stone corridors echo with a chaotic din of absolute noise, screaming laughter, and deep debauchery. At the center of the grand hall, lounging carelessly on the sacred papal throne, sits Octavian of Tusculum. He is a ruthless, deeply spoilt teenager who has just been crowned Pope John XII at the absurdly young age of 18. To understand how a reckless youth gained absolute spiritual sovereignty over the Western world, we have to unearth the geopolitical chaos of 10th century Rome. This dark historical era was so uniquely corrupt that secular and religious historians alike refer to it by a deeply unsettling name: the pornocracy, or the rule of the harlots. John XII did not ascend the throne through theological merit, devotion, or divine selection. His ascent was the result of raw dynastic tyranny. His powerful warlord father, Alberic II of Spoleto, controlled Rome with an iron fist. On his deathbed, Alberic forced the Roman nobility and clergy to swear a binding oath to elect his teenage son as the next pope, effectively fusing the ultimate spiritual office with total secular political control over the papal states. Once the tiara was placed on his head, the teenage monarch unleashed a wave of institutional depravity that shocked even the hardened citizens of Rome. The most terrifying documentation of his reign doesn't come from external enemies, but from contemporary, eyewitness accounts left behind by Bishop Liutprand of Cremona, a highly respected diplomat and chronicler of the era. Liutprand's secret chronicles detail how John XII systematically dismantled centuries of sacred tradition, converting the Lateran Palace into a literal functioning brothel. The sprawling residence became a den of predators. It was openly recorded that the palace was completely unsafe for respectable women to enter. Pilgrims traveling thousands of miles to seek absolution in Rome were warned by locals to stay far away from the Lateran. John XII and his violent inner circle routinely operated like a street gang, abducting female pilgrims, vulnerable noblewomen, and even cloistered nuns straight from their sanctuaries to populate the Pope's ongoing nightly orgies. But the debauchery wasn't merely a matter of unchecked carnal desires. It crossed directly into deliberate performative sacrilege. John XII seemed to take a malicious, calculated joy in mocking the very God he supposedly represented. During high-stakes dice games and lavish gambling sessions with the Roman elites, the palace would suddenly drop into a tense, expectant silence. John XII would raise a golden chalice and openly toast to the health of ancient pagan deities. Witnesses testified under oath at the Synod of Rome that the Pope regularly invoked the names of Venus, Jupiter, and even Satan himself, begging the dark forces to bring him good luck on his wagers. To fund his chaotic lifestyle, he ran the Vatican like a black market enterprise, selling sacred church titles and bishoprics to the highest bidder. In one of his most infamous acts of blatant disrespect, the young Pope conducted a formal ordination ceremony for a 10-year-old boy, naming him a bishop of the church inside the filthy stalls of a horse stable. By 963 AD, the systemic outrage reached a catastrophic boiling point. The Holy Roman Emperor, Otto the Great, marched his imperial army directly onto Rome, convening a special council to depose the rogue teenager on charges of sacrilege, murder, perjury, and incest. Sensing his imminent capture, John XII didn't stay to face his accusers. Instead, he stripped the Vatican's secret treasury of its vast wealth, packed the gold onto horses, and fled into the safety of the Campania Mountains to wait for the political storm to pass. The moment Emperor Otto withdrew his main forces from the city, John XII struck back with terrifying asymmetric violence. He returned to Rome at the head of a mercenary army, hunting down the clergy who had voted against him. He carried out a series of brutal, retaliatory mutilations, ordering his guards to cut off the hands, split the noses, and tear out the tongues of his political rivals. Yet his ultimate end did not come from an imperial army, a grand crusade, or a formal church council. It came from a shadow in the bedroom. On the night of May 14, 964 AD, an ordinary furious Roman citizen named Stephen quietly slipped past the palace security. He burst into a private candle-lit bedchamber in the middle of the night, catching Pope John XII directly in bed with his wife. Without a single moment's hesitation, the jealous husband unleashed a wave of pure, unbridled rage. Stephen delivered a series of crushing blows, fracturing the skull of the Vicar of Christ before dragging his lifeless, bleeding body across the floor and throwing it out of the high window into the dirt and filth below. John XII weaponized the papacy for pleasure. But 200 years later, a completely innocent holy man would find out that trying to give the papacy back was a death sentence. Chapter 27. The Hermit Pope. The Caged Saint. High up on the isolated, freezing slopes of Mount Moroni in central Italy, the year is 1294. The only sound is the hollow, howling wind rushing through a tiny, mud-walled cave. Inside lives Pietro de Moroni, an 84-year-old hermit. He wears a shirt made of coarse, irritating horsehair, sleeps on the bare rock, and spends his days in absolute, unbroken silence, completely detached from the mortal world. But that silence is shattered by a massive, colourful procession winding up the mountain path. Armoured soldiers and purple-robed cardinals are ascending the peaks to find him. Down in Rome, the papal conclave has been deadlocked in a bitter, toxic political stalemate for over 2 years. In a desperate, wild move to break the tie, the desperate cardinals elected this illiterate, isolated hermit as the supreme leader of the Catholic Church. Pietro does not celebrate. He is dragged down the mountain in absolute tears, entirely against his will, and crowned Pope Celestine V. The transition from a quiet mountain cave to the cutthroat political arena of Naples is an unmitigated disaster. Celestine V is completely out of his depth. He doesn't know Latin fluently. He cannot navigate the complex, treacherous legal treaties of Europe, and greedy cardinals quickly realize how easily he can be manipulated. They trick the overwhelmed old man into signing blank official decrees, which they use to enrich themselves and consolidate power behind his back, realizing that his soul is in extreme danger, and that his structural incompetence is destroying the church. Celestine V seeks a way out. He consults a brilliant, highly calculating canon lawyer, Cardinal Benedetto Catani. Catani systematically feeds the old man's deep anxieties. According to dark rumors buried in the historical paper trail, Catani goes so far as to rig a secret speaking tube directly into the Pope's bedroom wall. In the dead of night, a disembodied voice echoes through the darkness, mimicking the voice of God, commanding the fragile hermit to abdicate the throne for his own salvation. It works perfectly. On December 13, 1294, after just 5 months of psychological torment, Celestine V reads a historic resignation decree, steps down, and happily puts his old rags back on to return to his mountain cave. But absolute power breeds absolute paranoia. The conniving lawyer, Cardinal Catani, is immediately elected as the new Pope Boniface VIII. Boniface VIII quickly realizes that as long as the old universally loved hermit is breathing, his own enemies could kidnap him, declare the historic resignation invalid, and spark a catastrophic schism within the church. He cannot allow Pietro to remain free. The new pope orders his papal guards to hunt down the 85-year-old man like an escaped criminal. What follows is a terrifying high-stakes manhunt through the wilderness. Celestine V flees through dense Italian forests, sleeping in ditches and hiding in remote caves. In a final desperate bid for freedom, he attempts to cross the Adriatic Sea on a small fishing boat, but a brutal sudden storm washes him back ashore, directly into the waiting arms of the papal trackers. Instead of showing any mercy to his fragile predecessor, Boniface VIII drags the old man to the remote, high-altitude castle of Fumone. He locks the former pope inside a tiny, windowless stone cell, built deep within the thick fort walls. The cell is so narrow and claustrophobic that the elderly man cannot even stand up fully or stretch his limbs. The heavy iron bolts slide into place with a sharp metallic ring, sealing him in total darkness. Celestine V is kept in complete isolation, exposed to freezing mountain drafts, rats, and terrible dampness. For 10 agonizing months, his muffled prayers echo down the stone corridors. On May 19, 1296, the hermit pope finally dies in his cage. For centuries, the official Vatican ledger maintained that Pietro da Moroni passed away peacefully from natural causes related to his advanced age. But the historical paper trail holds a much darker reality. When modern forensic scientists finally exhumed Celestine V's remarkably preserved skull, they discovered a terrifying anomaly. Driven directly into the center of his frontal bone was a clean, highly specific rectangular hole. It was the unmistakable, brutal signature of a heavy iron nail driven straight into his brain while he slept in his cell. Celestine V was destroyed by a silent, internal papal conspiracy. But 2 centuries later, the Vatican would face an external wave of pure, unbridled violence that transformed the high altars into an absolute slaughterhouse. Chapter 28. The Sack of Rome. Apocalypse 1527. Imagine standing in the heart of the Vatican as a distant, thunderous roar of black powder cannons echoes across the horizon. Then, the usual calm is shattered by the chaotic clanging of swords striking plate armor, accompanied by the terrified screaming of thousands of people echoing through narrow, claustrophobic stone alleys. This isn't a bad dream. This is the exact sonic landscape of Rome on its single darkest day. History books call it a battle, but in reality, it was a literal apocalypse. In the spring of 1527, the sovereign heart of the Catholic Church didn't just fall, it was subjected to a wave of absolute unbridled savagery that nearly wiped the papacy off the map forever. To understand how close the Vatican came to total erasure, we have to break down the cold, terrifying tactical timeline of a siege driven by starving mercenaries and deep religious hatred. Let's look closer at how the entire system collapsed step by step. A thick, completely unnatural fog rolls off the Tiber River, blanket wrapping the ancient city of Rome in a ghostly white shroud. Visibility drops to near zero. Outside the ancient Aurelian walls stands a freezing, starving, and completely mutinous army of over 20,000 imperial soldiers under the nominal command of Charles V. Among them are thousands of Landsknechts, fanatical German Protestant mercenaries fueled by a fierce, anti-papal religious fervor. They haven't been paid a single coin in months. Their leaders have promised them one thing to prevent a total mutiny: the unchecked pillage of the wealthiest city in Europe. Under the cover of the dense fog, they launch a frantic, desperate assault on the ramparts, slicing through the defenders and breaking through the vulnerable Borgo district within hours. The mutinous horde surges like a tidal wave directly toward St. Peter's Basilica, their heavy leather boots splashing through blood. Standing completely alone on the cold steps of the high altar are 189 soldiers of the Swiss Guard. They look out at a sea of thousands of enraged mercenaries and know there is zero hope of survival. Formed into a tight, defensive phalanx, they fight with absolute suicidal bravery. The air fills with the sounds of snapping pikes and agonizing screams. One by one they are brutally cut down, run through with iron blades and shot at point-blank range. Only 42 guards survive the initial onslaught, sacrificing their bodies to buy precious minutes for the Supreme Pontiff. As the Protestant mercenaries smash through the main doors of the basilica, their weapons echo on the marble. Inside, Pope Clement VII is literally dragged from his desperate prayers by his remaining advisors. They sprint frantically toward the Passetto di Borgo, a secret, elevated, 800-meter-long fortified brick corridor connecting the Vatican palaces directly to the massive fortress of Castel Sant'Angelo. The Pope can hear the heavy, frantic footsteps of his pursuers sprinting right down the echoing brick tunnel beneath him. To ensure his bright white papal robes don't make him an easy target for enemy snipers down in the streets, a quick-thinking cardinal throws a dark, heavy wool cloak over the Pope's head as they run along the narrow wall, while musket bullets strike the brickwork all around them. With the Pope safely locked behind the heavy iron gates and thick stone walls of Castel Sant'Angelo, the mutinous army turns the abandoned Vatican complex into a living nightmare. There are no rules, no morals, and no mercy. Priests are dragged by their hair into the public streets, subjected to cruel mock trials, and brutally tortured to reveal the locations of hidden gold. Nuns are dragged from their cloisters and violently assaulted directly on top of the sacred marble altars. The tombs of historic dead popes are smashed open with heavy iron crowbars. Their ancient decaying bodies are stripped of gold rings and jewelry before being callously scattered across the blood-soaked floors. The violence didn't stop at physical slaughter. The Landsknechts took their anti-papal fury to a highly symbolic, deeply disturbing level. They raided the sacred wardrobes, dressing up their muddy horses in priceless papal vestments and marching them through the burning halls of the Vatican. They staged a mocking, drunken procession through the streets of Rome, formally declaring a common illiterate soldier as their new pope. The architectural and cultural damage was catastrophic. The priceless library of the Vatican, containing centuries of irreplaceable knowledge, was completely ransacked. Mercenaries used ancient, handwritten manuscripts and papal bulls as mere kindling to start bonfires on the grand marble floors just to keep themselves warm during the chilly nights. For 8 agonizing months, the Pope remained a helpless prisoner inside Castel Sant'Angelo, looking out at his burning city. By the time the occupying army finally withdrew, Rome was left completely hollowed out, entirely stripped of its vast wealth, empty of its traumatized population, and physically destroyed. The sack of 1527 was an act of open, public wartime savagery. But in the 20th century, the Church would participate in a far more covert, silent form of slaughter, carried out from the belly of military cargo planes. Chapter 29. The Death Flights. Operation Condor. Imagine a deafening, low industrial roar, filling a cramped, vibrating aircraft cabin. It is the sound of a twin-engine military cargo plane cutting through the midnight sky high above the South Atlantic. Suddenly, a freezing blast of wind punctures the interior as the rear fuselage door slides open. The high-frequency whistling of the atmosphere drowns out almost everything, except for one distinct, terrifying sound, the sharp, mechanical click of a pair of handcuffs being unlocked in the pitch black. Step inside Buenos Aires, Argentina. The year is 1976. Walk behind the sterile, highly secured concrete walls of the Navy Mechanics School, known simply to the locals as ESMA. To the outside world, this is a standard military educational facility. But behind these closed doors lies the dark, pulsing heart of Operation Condor, a coordinated campaign of state-sponsored terror designed to eradicate anyone suspected of left-wing political dissent. The right-wing military junta running the country didn't just arrest dissidents, they made them disappear from existence entirely. To ensure there were absolutely no physical bodies left behind to trigger international investigations, the military devised a clinical execution method known as the vuelos de la muerte, the death flights. Students, journalists, and young activists were rounded up, stripped completely naked, and injected with a massive, paralyzing dose of pentothal, told they were merely being transferred to a regular facility. The semi-conscious victims were stacked like cargo into the bellies of transport planes, flown out 10,000 feet over the open ocean, and cast out into the black void below. But here is the question that should keep you awake at night. Where was the Catholic Church while this conveyor belt of human slaughter was actively running? Argentina was an intensely religious nation, and the military junta was fanatically Catholic. They publicly declared their regime was fighting a holy crusade to protect Western Christian civilization from godless communism. The horrific truth is that the cross didn't just stand beside the sword, it actively blessed it. Declassified dossiers reveal a terrifying network of collaboration involving the military chaplains assigned directly to these black sites. Consider the case of Father Christian von Wernick, a prominent priest who routinely frequented the torture chambers of Esma. Von Wernick didn't offer comfort or advocate for the prisoners' rights. Instead, testimonies from survivors reveal that he weaponized the sacred sacrament of confession. He would sit beside terrified, bleeding prisoners, offering fake spiritual absolution to extract sensitive political data and names of co-conspirators, information he immediately handed over to the military executioners. The complicity went far deeper than a few isolated rogue priests operating in the shadows. The entire institutional apparatus was compromised. Witness accounts from surviving military pilots later revealed that dropping hundreds of naked, drugged humans into a pitch-black ocean took a massive, catastrophic psychological toll. Many pilots returned to base suffering from acute trauma, vivid nightmares, and overwhelming existential guilt that threatened to break the chain of command. To stabilize their specialized workforce, the military hierarchy brought in high-ranking Catholic chaplains to provide intensive spiritual counseling. Instead of condemning the atrocities, the priests systematically normalized the mass murder. They explicitly told the spiraling pilots that the death flights were actually a deeply Christian and merciful form of death, because the pentothal injection ensured the victims didn't suffer on the way down. The chaplains routinely quoted biblical scripture to calm the pilots' fractured psyches, specifically citing parables about separating the wheat from the chaff. They assured the executioners that they were merely acting as God's instruments, purifying the fabric of the state by purging the unholy elements from society. If you look even higher up the chain of command, the mystery turns into absolute horror. Let's look directly at the Vatican's official representative in Argentina at the time, Apostolic Nuncio Cardinal Pio Laghi. While the death flights were operating at peak capacity, thousands of desperate, weeping mothers gathered every single day outside the embassies and church steps, begging the religious authorities for any shred of information regarding their disappeared children. Yet, while those mothers wept in the streets, Cardinal Laghi was regularly photographed enjoying elite private tennis matches with Admiral Emilio Massera, one of the chief architects of the death flight program and the undisputed master of the Esma torture facility. Despite receiving detailed, explicit intelligence briefs detailing the secret detention centers, the systematic drugging, and the mass ocean drops, the Vatican maintained a cold, absolute diplomatic silence throughout the entire dictatorship. They chose to preserve their strategic political alliance with the anti-communist regime, choosing institutional power over basic human morality. They left the families of the victims completely abandoned, forced to stare out at the rolling waves for bodies that would never come home. The Vatican stayed silent while the Argentine military threw dissidents into the ocean. But in the small towns of Ireland, the church didn't need the military's help to build a private network of high-walled prisons for innocent women. Chapter 30. The Magdalene Laundries. The whitewashed graves. Listen to the steady, heavy thud-thud of industrial steam washing machines spinning inside a damp, echoing room. Beneath that mechanical roar, listen for the wet, scraping sound of wooden brushes rhythmically scrubbing stone floors, while a cold Irish rain patters relentlessly against thick, leaded glass windows. If you stand completely still in the corridor, you might hear it, the faint, muffled sound of an infant crying from somewhere deep inside an echo-filled hallway. This isn't a factory, it is a house of God. Or rather, it was a network of highly organized, state-sanctioned industrial prisons disguised as sanctuaries of holy mercy. Turn the clock back to Dublin, Ireland. The year is 1996. A news camera crew stands outside the imposing brick facade of the Sean McDermott Street Convent. On this day, the very last Magdalene laundry in Ireland is officially locking its heavy iron doors for good. For over 2 centuries, these massive, fortress-like facilities operated across the Irish landscape under a carefully manicured facade of holy charity, presenting themselves to the public as benign refuge for the rehabilitation of fallen women. But when investigators finally peeled back the whitewashed exterior, they uncovered a dark truth. The laundries were not sanctuaries. They were a highly organized network of commercial forced labor camps run directly by orders of Catholic nuns, including the Sisters of Mercy and the Sisters of Our Lady of Charity. It was a system where any woman who dared to defy the rigid, hyper-conservative social norms of 20th century Ireland could be signed away, locked behind high stone walls and committed indefinitely without a trial, a judge or a right to appeal. When independent researchers finally gained access to the restricted intake archives, the chilling profiles of the inmates came to light. These women were not hardened criminals or violent offenders. The files show they were unmarried pregnant girls, victims of severe domestic assault, quiet orphans who had outgrown the state asylum system, or simply young women deemed too attractive, independent, or rebellious by local parish priests. The moment a girl stepped past the threshold of a laundry, her identity was systematically executed. Her civilian clothes were confiscated, her hair was aggressively cropped, and her real name was stripped away entirely. She was given an arbitrary identification number, or forced to answer to the name of an obscure Catholic saint. The daily routine was a masterclass in psychological and physical destruction. The inmates were forced to endure 12 to 15 hours of brutal unpaid manual labor every single day, 6 days a week. They spent their lives hoisting heavy, scalding linens for commercial hotels, military barracks, and elite government contracts. To break their spirits, the nuns enforced a rule of absolute mandatory silence. Speaking to another inmate was strictly forbidden. If a girl dropped a bar of soap, paused from exhaustion, or shed a tear over her stolen life, she was subjected to severe physical punishments, starvation diets, or public humiliation. But the dark heart of this system lay within the specialized mother and baby homes, structurally attached to these institutions. When an unmarried, pregnant girl gave birth inside these concrete walls, the ultimate cruelty was enacted. The moment the child was delivered, it was instantly torn from the mother's arms by the nuns. The young mothers were forced under extreme psychological duress to sign forged or coercive relinquishment documents. If they asked where their children were being taken, they were routinely lied to and told their babies had passed away from sudden natural causes. In reality, the Church had established a highly lucrative, entirely covert international black market adoption ring. Thousands of completely healthy Irish infants were systematically sold to wealthy Catholic families in the United States in exchange for massive cash-based donations. These transactions completely bypassed ordinary financial ledgers, funneling directly into the private, unmonitored bank accounts of the convents. The true physical scale of this horror did not fully surface into the public consciousness until a local independent historian named Catherine Corliss began conducting a meticulous demographic audit in Tuam, County Galway. Investigating a historic mother and baby home formerly run by the Bon Secours sisters, Corliss discovered official state death certificates for 796 children who had died inside the facility between 1925 and 1961. Yet, when she cross-referenced those names with local church registries, she discovered an impossible anomaly. There were 0 corresponding burial records, 0 marked graves, and 0 traces of where nearly 800 children had been laid to rest. The mystery triggered a formal forensic excavation of the convent grounds, and what the ground-penetrating radar revealed sent shockwaves through the international community. The nuns had not provided Christian burials, coffins, or even simple plots of earth for the deceased children. Instead, the forensic team discovered that the tiny bodies of hundreds of infants and toddlers had been systematically packed, stacked, and concealed inside a 20-chamber decommissioned concrete septic tank located directly beneath the convent's outdoor playground. The very institution that claimed to be the ultimate moral compass of the nation had literally buried its crimes in human waste, leaving generations of children to rot in total darkness while their mothers searched for them across the globe. Chapter 31. The Borgia Pope and the Palace of Pleasures. Rome, August 1492. The sweltering summer heat bakes the cobblestone streets, carrying with it the stench of disease, rot, and impending chaos. Inside the thick walls of the apostolic palace, the conclave is deadlocked. The cardinals are exhausted, desperate, and entirely corruptible. Enter Rodrigo Borgia, a man whose name would become synonymous with the absolute nadir of spiritual depravity. Rodrigo didn't pray for the papacy. He bought it. Under the cover of night, literal mule loads of silver were quietly funneled through the shadows of Rome, delivered straight to the doorsteps of rival cardinals. To Cardinal Ascanio Sforza alone, Rodrigo dispatched 4 massive cartloads of silver coins, effectively securing his vote. When the white smoke finally billowed from the Sistine Chapel, Rodrigo emerged as Pope Alexander VI. The Holy See was no longer just the center of the Christian world. It had been successfully converted into an elite, crime-ridden family syndicate. To secure his newly purchased empire, Alexander VI relied on 2 lethal enforcement assets. First, his ruthless son, Cesare Borgia, a a calculating psychopath who served as the family's military muscle and political executioner. Second, his strategically placed daughter, Lucrezia Borgia, a woman utilized as a political pawn, married off repeatedly to forge powerful alliances, only for those husbands to mysteriously disappear whenever their utility ran dry. If you crossed the Borgia family, you didn't just end up dead, you vanished from inside out. The family's rise to absolute power was fueled by a terrifying secret weapon known to contemporary chroniclers as cantarella. This was a white, completely tasteless, sugary powder, derived from an intricate mixture of arsenic and phosphorus. The family wore their toxicity on their fingers. Hollow signet rings, intricately carved with the family crest, contained a hidden compartment holding the lethal powder. A subtle flick of the wrist over an adversary's silver chalice during a toast was all it took. Within days, the victim would suffer an agonizing, systematic organ collapse that baffled Renaissance physicians. Alexander VI didn't just use cantarella to eliminate political threats. He used it as a grotesque financial strategy. Under Vatican law at the time, the vast estates of deceased cardinals automatically reverted back to the papacy if they died without a valid will. Alexander would intentionally target the wealthiest cardinals in Rome, slip cantarella into their wine during intimate dinner parties, and watch them choke to death over a period of weeks. As their bodies failed, the Borgia vaults filled with the stolen gold, lands and palaces required to fund Cesare's brutal military campaigns. By 1501, the Vatican had completely transformed from a house of prayer into a palace of unvarnished hedonism. But nothing could prepare the city for the night of October 31st, 1501, an event that remains etched in history as the absolute peak of Vatican sacrilege. According to the meticulous, terrifying eyewitness accounts written by the Apostolic Master of Ceremonies, Johann Burchard, Cesare Borgia hosted an official party inside the papal apartments. History remembers it as the Banquet of Chestnuts. As the wine flowed and the lute music turned dark and frantic, 50 naked courtesans were escorted into the dining hall. After dinner, the candelabras were moved from the tables and placed flat onto the cold marble floor. Thousands of burning chestnuts were then scattered across the stone. At a signal from Cesare, the courtesans were forced to crawl on their hands and knees through the burning candles to gather the chestnuts with their teeth. Watching this, laughing and cheering them on, was the Borgia Pope himself, flanked by his daughter Lucrezia. To escalate the madness, the Pope announced an official competition. High-value prizes, including fine silk robes and bags of gold, were awarded to the guests who could indulge in the most depraved acts with the courtesans right there on the floor. It wasn't a secret underground cult, it was a papal-sanctioned gala. But a dynasty built on poison and blood always devours itself from within. The cracks in the Borgia syndicate split wide open with the sudden violent assassination of Giovanni Borgia, the Pope's eldest and favourite son. In June 1497, Giovanni's body was fished out of the murky Tiber River. His throat had been brutally slashed, his body stabbed 9 times, and his hands securely bound. The hit was professional, cold and calculated. The investigation quickly went cold for one terrifying reason. All evidence pointed directly to his own brother, Cesare Borgia. Cesare wanted absolute control of the papal armies, and Giovanni was in his way. The Pope was forced to bury his favourite son in absolute silence, knowing the killer sat at his own dinner table. 6 years later, the cosmic ledger finally caught up with the Borgia Pope. In August 1503, during a humid Roman night, Alexander VI and Cesare hosted a dinner party for a wealthy cardinal they intended to poison. But a fatal error occurred in the kitchen. A servant mixed up the decanters, serving the poisoned wine to the Borgias instead. Although his son, young and resilient, narrowly survived by immersing himself in a bath of ice and animal blood, the 72-year-old Pope stood no chance. The cantarella tore through his stomach. Within hours, eyewitnesses recorded that the Borgia Pope's body bloated to a monstrous size, his skin turned completely pitch black, and his tongue swelled so massively that his jaw could not close. His corpse decomposed so rapidly and putridly that guards had to violently kick and cram the swollen body into a mismatched coffin. The empire built on poison had finally been poisoned by its own hand. From the glittering, poison-laced banquets of the Renaissance, we shift to a dark, rainy night in Palermo, where a knife-wielding syndicate cut a multi-million-dollar masterpiece right out of its holy frame. Chapter 32. The Stolen Caravaggio. Palermo, Sicily, October 17, 1969. A torrential autumn storm hammers the Mediterranean coast, drowning out the sounds of the city under a sheet of violent rain. At the coordinates of the Oratory of St. Lawrence, a small historic church tucked deep within Palermo's labyrinthine alleys, the security infrastructure is practically non-existent. There are no motion sensors, no cameras, and no night watchmen. Only a single fragile lock stands between the street and a masterpiece of world heritage. Under the absolute cover of the tempest, two figures slip into the pitch-black sanctuary. They do not look at the gilded altars or the sacred relics. Their eyes are fixed entirely on the high altar, where Caravaggio's 1600 masterpiece Nativity with St. Francis and St. Lawrence hangs in the dark. The thieves work with a cold, terrifying efficiency. One produces a sharp razor blade. The silence of the church is broken only by the distinct, sickening hiss of steel slicing through 300-year-old linen canvas. They strip the massive painting clean out of its wooden frame, roll it up like a cheap rug, and drag it through the rain toward an idling vintage diesel vehicle waiting in the mud outside. By morning, only an empty frame remains, staring back at a horrified parish. What the thieves didn't realize was that they were handling a ticking chronological bomb. Caravaggio's canvas was massive, measuring nearly 6 square meters of dense, heavy material layered with brittle oil paint centuries old. It was never meant to bend, let alone bend tightly. The forensic assessment of the crime scene revealed a devastating level of criminal amateurism. Because the thieves were completely uneducated in art preservation, they rolled the priceless masterpiece backward with the paint facing inward. As the canvas flexed and creaked under the pressure, the ancient paint layers immediately began to fracture. With every single mile the getaway vehicle traveled over Sicily's bumpy, unpaved roads, thousands of tiny flakes of irreplaceable color shattered off the fabric, dusting the floor of the vehicle like colored snow. The very act of stealing the Nativity began its permanent, systematic erasure from existence. By the time it reached its first hidden destination, it was already heavily mutilated. For decades, the case file remained a black hole of forensic dead ends. That is, until the Italian state launched a massive crackdown on the Sicilian mafia, forcing high-ranking Cosa Nostra mobsters to turn state's evidence. The transcripts from these anti-mafia trials don't solve the mystery. They turn it into a gothic horror story. The testimonies are deeply conflicting, casting a layer of terrifying uncertainty over the painting's final destination. Mafioso Francesco Mourinho Mannoia testified under oath that he was the specialist brought in to assess the stolen painting for a high-level black market sale. He claimed that because the thieves had handled the canvas so roughly, the paint was peeling off in huge chunks. According to Mannoia, the mafia hierarchy looked at the ruined masterpiece, wept at the loss of its immense financial leverage, and coldly ordered the entire canvas burned to ashes to destroy the evidence. Years later, a rival mafia defector named Gaspare Spartuzza brought forward a completely different, stomach-churning narrative. He testified that the painting had been handed over to the powerful Polarà Mafia clan for safekeeping. The clan allegedly hid the masterpiece in an isolated, damp barn on the outskirts of Palermo. Spartuzza claimed that when family members went to check on the multi-million-dollar asset months later, they discovered the barn was heavily infested. The unprotected canvas had been systematically chewed to pieces, shredded, and eaten by starving rats and pigs. Despite these grim underworld accounts, Italy's elite art police, the Comando Carabinieri Tutela Patrimonio Culturale, refused to close the dossier. They suspect the mafia intentionally floated stories of the painting's total destruction to get the authorities to call off the dogs, allowing the asset to be traded silently among billionaire collectors in the global underground. Today, the theft ranks as one of the FBI's top 10 art crimes. The empty frame in Palermo has been filled with a high-tech digital replica, a ghost on the wall where a genius once painted. The original remains lost in a fog of mafia omertà, money laundering, and structural decay. The mafia destroyed a priceless painting of Christ's birth. But centuries earlier, a simple piece of unleavened bread in an Italian village, physically transformed into something far more terrifying: raw, beating human meat. Chapter 33. The Miracle of Lanciano, the Living Heart Anatomy. Our story doesn't begin in a laboratory under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. It begins 1200 years ago, in the year 750 AD, inside a small, dim sanctuary in Lanciano, Italy. A Basilian monk stands before the altar. On the outside, he looks the part of a devout servant. On the inside, however, a quiet, corrosive rot has taken hold. He is enduring a massive, suffocating crisis of faith. Every day he performs the liturgy, and every day a silent voice whispers to him that it is all a theatre, a psychological trick played on the desperate. He doubts the very core of his theology, the literal physical presence of the divine in the Eucharist. On this particular morning, as he pronounces the ancient words of consecration over the unleavened bread and wine, something goes horribly wrong, or perhaps horribly right. The prayers tear from his throat. But before he can finish the ritual, the laws of physics simply break. The wafer doesn't remain bread. Right before his eyes, it spontaneously transmutates, shrinking and wrinkling into a ring of raw, fibrous flesh. In the chalice, The wine deepens, thickens, and coagulates into 5 distinct, jagged clots of blood. The monk collapses to his knees, weeping. The silent sanctuary is suddenly heavy with the metallic scent of copper and fresh iron. For over a millennium, this material was kept in a silver vessel, completely exposed to the elements, dust, and centuries of fluctuating temperatures. No airtight seals were used. No ancient embalming techniques were applied. It simply sat there, defying decay, waiting for an era advanced enough to test its true nature. The modern state of this ancient anomaly can still be seen today, preserved in its historical casing for public viewing. In 1970, the Vatican decided to step in. They wanted answers, or perhaps they wanted to debunk it once and for all to avoid modern scientific embarrassment. They issued an official invitation to Dr. Linoli, a world-class professor of anatomy and pathological histology, the highly specialized study of diseased tissue under a microscope. Linoli was a man of cold, unyielding science. He didn't care for legends, he cared for cellular structures, fixatives, and control groups. Alongside Dr. Ruggero Batelli, he was handed the unpreserved, ancient specimen and given complete freedom to subject it to a rigorous laboratory analysis. The structural framework of his evaluation was meticulous. Under strict forensic protocols, Linoli took microsamples of the hardened brown ring of flesh and the dark, calcified blood clots. He prepared the slides, turned off the main overheads, and turned on the microscope. When Linoli looked through the lens, the expectations of the scientific team completely shattered. This wasn't dried, ancient dough. It wasn't a clever medieval forgery made of animal skin or petrified wood mold. The slide revealed the unmistakable, intricate architecture of a human heart. Specifically, the cross-sections isolated the endocardium, the smooth internal lining of the heart cavities, and the thick, braided muscular walls of the myocardium. As the slide projector clicked, illuminating the stark fibrous bands on the laboratory wall, Linoli identified something even more specific: tissue from the left ventricle. This was a perfectly preserved slice of the exact cardiac engine responsible for pumping life throughout the body. But it was the forensic condition of the cells that sent a chill through the room. To understand why this is anomalous, we have to look at basic taphonomy, the science of how organisms decay. When a human dies, their cellular structures collapse almost immediately. Enzymes begin eating the tissue from the inside out in a process called autolysis. Without heavy chemical preservatives like formaldehyde, a piece of flesh left in an open-air container for 1,200 years should be nothing but a handful of unrecognizable dust. Yet, under Linoli's microscope, the proteins within the myocardium were completely intact. The molecular structure mirrored that of fresh human muscle. It didn't look like an artifact dug out of an 8th century tomb. It looked like a surgical biopsy taken from an operating room down the hall. Then came the blood analysis. When the team typed the 5 ancient clots, the results came back identical across every sample. AB positive, it is a rare blood type. But more importantly, it is the exact same, highly specific blood profile discovered during the forensic mapping of the Shroud of Turin. Linoli sat back from his microscope, the hum of the centrifuge the only sound keeping him anchored to reality. In his official forensic logs, he penned a sentence that still haunts the halls of pathological science. The tissue is a heart. It is alive. It contains the proteins of a body that died only minutes ago. Think about the implications of that statement. Science didn't demystify the relic. It made it infinitely more terrifying. It suggested that somewhere, locked within a silver casing in a quiet Italian town, a piece of a human being is trapped in a permanent, timeless loop of immediate post-mortem existence. A heart that refuses to become history. But as chilling as a living relic under a microscope might be, the true horror lies not in what the science revealed, but in what it was meant to validate. A piece of living flesh proving divinity under a microscope is a miracle the Church would gladly celebrate. But what if that same divinity carried a terminal warning? In our next deep dive, we uncover why the Vatican would go to absolute war to bury a hidden prophecy, one that predicted this exact living divinity would soon be completely corrupted from the inside out by the very men sworn to protect it. Chapter 34. The Third Secret of Fatima. There is a distinct brand of terror that doesn't rely on monsters or shadows. It's the horror of a hidden truth, something so profoundly destabilizing that the highest authorities on earth would willingly break their word to humanity just to keep it buried. For over a century, the Roman Catholic Church has guarded an enigma wrapped in wax and paper. A document so radioactive it has allegedly made popes weep, drove a former monk to commit international air piracy, and sparked an enduring theory that the ultimate seat of spiritual authority has already been compromised from within. This is the timeline of a secret that broke the vault. It begins in the dust of a world at war. On May 13, 1917, in the isolated fields of Cova de Iria near Fatima, Portugal, three young shepherd children, Lucia Santos and her cousins Francisco and Jacinta Mato, claimed to witness a luminous lady standing above a holm oak tree. What followed over the next few months culminated in the miracle of the sun, an event witnessed by 70,000 people who watched the solar disk dance, change colors and plunge toward the Earth. But away from the public spectacle, the entity confided three distinct prophetic messages to the children. The first two secrets were terrifying, but conceptually straightforward. They offered a visceral vision of hell, a vast sea of fire teeming with demons and suffering souls, followed by a precise geopolitical warning, the imminent end of World War I, countered by the chilling prediction that if humanity did not cease offending God, an even worse conflict would erupt during the next pontificate, signaled by an unknown light in the night sky. History, unfortunately, validated those words. But it was the third secret that carried a unique, terrifying weight. Unlike the others, this prophecy was not to be shared immediately. Written down years later by a surviving Lucia, the text was slipped into an envelope, sealed with heavy wax and delivered across borders. Her instructions from the Virgin Mary were explicit, unyielding and ironclad. The envelope was under no circumstances to be opened until the year 1960. When asked why that specific year was chosen, Sister Lucia simply remarked, "Because then it will be clearer." As the calendar turned to 1960, the global Catholic community waited with bated breath. The promised year had arrived. The world was locked in the icy grip of the Cold War. Nuclear annihilation felt like a distinct possibility. People desperately wanted to know what heaven had warned them about. Instead, they got an ominous, crushing silence. Behind the fortress-like walls of the Vatican, Pope John XXIII requested the envelope. Accompanied only by a handful of high-ranking Portuguese translators and confidants, he broke the wax seal in the absolute privacy of his personal quarters. What happened in that room remains an unsettling blind spot in ecclesiastical history. According to various close accounts and diary fragments from those within the inner circle, the Pope's face drained of all colour. He went completely pale, his hands trembling as his eyes scanned the handwritten pages. He did not read the text aloud to his advisors. He refused to give a public address. Instead, gripped by what can only be described as institutional panic, the pontiff ordered the text to be resealed immediately. Breaking the deadline promise made to the public, he commanded that the document be locked inside the heaviest steel safe of the Vatican's secret archives, declaring that the prophecy does not concern our time. The public was left in the dark, and the mystery mutated into something far more sinister. If a vision of hell itself was deemed fit for public consumption in 1917, what could possibly be written on those pages that was too horrific for the world to see in 1960? For 21 years, the secret sat behind steel doors. But human obsession is a volatile thing. It builds pressure in the dark until inevitably it explodes into real-world chaos. On May 2, 1981, Aer Lingus Flight 164 was a routine lunchtime flight, climbing through the grey skies over Ireland, carrying 103 passengers and 10 crew members from Dublin to London Heathrow. Just 5 minutes before the Boeing 737 was scheduled to descend into England, a 55-year-old Australian national named Lawrence James Downey slipped into the lavatory. Downey was no ordinary criminal. He was a deeply disturbed former Trappist monk who had spent years working as a tour guide at the Fatima Shrine in Portugal. He had become completely irreversibly consumed by the Vatican's silence. Emerging from the bathroom, doused in petrol and holding a lighter, Downey stormed the cockpit. He threatened to turn himself and the plane into a flying fireball unless the pilots diverted immediately. When told the aircraft lacked the fuel to reach his ultimate destination of Tehran, Iran, he forced a landing at Le Touquet Airport on the wind-whipped northern coast of France. For 8 grueling hours, a tense standoff played out on the tarmac. Yet, Downey didn't demand a multi-million-dollar ransom. He didn't want political prisoners freed. His sole frantic demand to the world was scrawled across a 9-page manifesto that he threw out of the cockpit window onto the asphalt below. He demanded that the Vatican release the authentic, unedited third secret of Fatima to the public. The hijacking was eventually brought to an end when French special forces stormed the aircraft, subduing Downey without casualties. But the event sent a shockwave through the collective consciousness. A man had literally held over 100 innocent lives hostage at 30,000 feet, not for gold or power, but for the text inside a locked Italian safe. Under immense mounting pressure spanning decades, the Vatican finally blinked in the year 2000. Under the direction of Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, The official text of the third secret was released to the world. The text described a surreal apocalyptic vision. A bishop in white walking through a half-ruined city filled with corpses, climbing a steep mountain toward a rough-hewn cross, where he is ultimately gunned down by a hail of bullets and arrows fired by soldiers. The Vatican officially closed the case, declaring that the vision merely predicted the failed 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II in St. Peter's Square. But for many investigative researchers and high-ranking insiders, the official release felt profoundly wrong. It felt like a calculated damage control campaign. Why would Pope John XXIII have gone pale and hidden a vision of a pope being shot when previous popes had already faced physical violence and assassination plots throughout history? Why would Sister Lucia state that the text would be clearer in 1960, when the assassination attempt didn't happen until 1981? The real horror lies in the terrifying leaks from those who allegedly laid eyes on the true, unredacted pages. The late Father Malachi Martin, a former Jesuit priest and Vatican insider, dropped chilling hints during late-night radio interviews before his death. He claimed the real text did not predict an external military assault on a pope. Instead, it warned of something infinitely worse, a total theological apostasy, a systematic falling away from the faith originating from the very top. The leaks suggest that the true text explicitly outlines the physical and spiritual infiltration of the Vatican by satanic forces. It allegedly describes a future where the leadership of the Church becomes corrupted, actively steering the faithful into spiritual darkness. Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani and Cardinal Mario Luigi Chiappe, the personal theologian to multiple popes, both dropped cryptic statements confirming that the secret details how the apostasy will begin at the top. If these leaks are accurate, the heavy clunk of that steel safe door in 1960 wasn't designed to protect the world from a terrifying prophecy. It was designed to protect the institution from a mirror. While the officially released secret predicted a tragic bishop falling under a hail of bullets in a ruined city, a real-life pope would meet a far more sudden, quiet end in a silent bedroom just 33 days after his election. Chapter 35. The Death of Pope John Paul I. The Vatican is a city built on silence. For centuries, its stone walls have kept secrets that could bring down empires. But in the late summer of 1978, that silence was broken by a sudden, heavy gasp in the dark. What happened inside those rooms on the night of September 28, 1978, remains one of the most chilling mysteries in modern history. This is the story of a 33-day papacy, a list of condemned men, and a clean-up operation so aggressive it borders on the terrifying. In August 1978, the papal conclave shocked the world by electing Albino Luciani as Pope John Paul I. He was dubbed the Smiling Pope. His warm, gentle demeanor captured the hearts of millions almost instantly. But behind that soft smile was a man of absolute steel. Luciani had inherited a nightmare. Deep within the golden vaults of the Vatican lay the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, better known as the Vatican Bank. It wasn't just handling the Church's charity funds, it had quietly morphed into a global clearinghouse for rampant financial corruption, money laundering, and black market deals. Even more disturbing were the whispers of an enemy within. The Pope discovered that high-ranking members of his own immediate staff, including cardinals and bank officials, were secretly linked to the illegal underground P2 Masonic Lodge, a shadow organization embedded in the highest echelons of Italian politics, banking, and organized crime. The new pope decided he was going to clean house. He ordered a complete restructuring of the bank and began drafting a list of high-level dismissals. He didn't realize he was running out of time. On the night of September 28, 1978, Pope John Paul I had been in office for exactly 33 days. At 11 p.m., the Pope retired to his bedroom. Witnesses noted he was carrying a thick stack of Vatican Bank restructuring files, along with a highly sensitive list of cardinals, bishops, and officials he intended to immediately dismiss and replace the very next morning. The grandfather clock ticked away the final hours of a man who believed he was about to purge the Church of its sins. Sister Vincenza, a nun who routinely brought the Pope his morning coffee, knocked on his door. No answer. She gently pushed the door open, stepping into the absolute stillness of the papal bedroom. What she saw froze her in place. The Pope was sitting upright in bed, propped up against his pillows. He was dead. His eyes were wide, and an eerie, unnatural grimace was frozen onto his face. In his cold hands, he still tightly clutched the secret transfer papers. Instead of calling an ambulance or the police, the Roman Curia went into a state of absolute panic. What followed wasn't an investigation, it was a ghost operation. Within minutes of the discovery, before an official coroner could even set foot inside the apostolic palace, The Pope's personal effects mysteriously vanished. His medicine bottle was gone, his reading glasses were gone, and the secret transfer documents he was holding in his hands, completely erased from existence. Then came the lies. The Vatican immediately released a public announcement claiming that the Pope's personal secretary, John McGee, had found his body at 5:30 a.m. Why lie about an hour? Why lie about who found him? Because of an ancient, rigid Vatican protocol. Church law strictly forbade a woman from entering the papal bedroom unescorted. To admit that Sister Vincenza had discovered the body at 4:30 a.m. would expose a massive breach of tradition, or worse, it would reveal that outsiders had access to the Pope in his final, fatal moments. They chose to falsify the timeline to protect the narrative. When independent investigators demanded an autopsy, the Vatican aggressively denied it, citing an ancient law that supposedly banned the post-mortem examination of a pope. To ensure no independent toxicology report could ever be made, they rushed his body to the embalmers within mere hours of his death. If someone wanted to destroy any trace of digitalis or a fast-acting liquid poison, they had just executed the perfect forensic erasure. An unautopsied pope, buried in a desperate hurry. His final reforms instantly wiped away. But the financial web that killed him wasn't just about stolen church money. The tracking numbers in those missing ledgers didn't lead to banks. They led to a multi-billion-dollar international shadow industry, trafficking the most vulnerable human beings on Earth. Chapter 36. The Vatican's links to trafficking. The Ghost Network. If you step inside the borders of Vatican City, you are entering the safest, most heavily guarded sovereign territory on Earth. But in the summer of 1983, a single wiretap cracked open a window into a shadow operation hidden directly behind the holy walls. A network where diplomacy, mafia blood money, and missing children bleed into one terrifying web. On the sweltering afternoon of June 22nd, 1983, 15-year-old Emanuela Orlandi walked out of her family's apartment. Her father was a dedicated lay employee of the papal household, granting the family rare, coveted citizenship inside the Vatican walls. Emanuela was a normal teenager, an aspiring musician heading across Rome for a routine flute lesson. She never made it back home. Witnesses later recalled seeing a dark, sleek BMW idling near her music school. A man had stepped out, offering her a bizarre, high-paying job selling cosmetics. Shortly after that conversation, Emanuela vanished into the Roman traffic. For the public, it was a tragic, mysterious kidnapping. But behind closed doors, intelligence wiretaps revealed something far more calculated. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. It was a precise, targeted extraction designed to strike at the absolute heart of the Holy See. Days after her disappearance, the Vatican switchboards were completely overwhelmed. Strangers with cold, calm voices bypassed standard security lines, demanding an immediate international exchange. Emanuela's life for the release of Mehmet Ali Agha, the extremist who had attempted to assassinate Pope John Paul II in St. Peter's Square 2 years prior. It felt like a high-stakes geopolitical thriller. But when forensic investigators and seasoned journalists began tracking the communication lines, the political narrative started to fall apart. The callers possessed highly classified information about internal Vatican security procedures and intimate family details that only a few high-ranking insiders could ever know. The political demands weren't an ultimatum. They were a highly sophisticated smokescreen. The kidnappers didn't care about a jailed assassin. They were using the global press coverage to send a terrifying, silent message to the people controlling the Vatican's money. To understand why a teenage girl became a pawn, you have to follow the money straight into a financial black hole. The Vatican Bank operates under total sovereign immunity. It is completely exempt from international financial audits, corporate oversight, or foreign police intervention. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, this absolute shield made the bank the perfect laundry machine for the Banda della Magliana, the most ruthless, blood-soaked faction of the Sicilian mafia in Rome. Led by the notorious Enrico de Pedis, the mob had funneled hundreds of millions of dollars into the Vatican's financial network, expecting their investments to be safely hidden away. Then, the system collapsed. Through rampant corruption and bad international deals, the Vatican-linked Banco Ambrosiano went completely bankrupt. The mafia's massive fortune evaporated overnight into a black hole of church debts. The mob wanted their money back, but they couldn't sue a sovereign church in a court of law. Instead, they turned to a brutal strategy, leveraging the absolute vulnerability of the people living inside the walls. By snatching a citizen of the Vatican city-state, the mafia created an unbreakable mechanism of financial blackmail, forcing high-ranking prelates into a desperate, silent compliance. But the financial blackmail was only the first layer of a much deeper horror. As the decades rolled on, declassified testimonies from former mafia mistresses, rogue intelligence agents and internal investigators began exposing the existence of a high society underground. According to these dark accounts, the network extended far beyond extortion. Young, vulnerable girls were routinely trafficked through a chain of private Vatican-owned luxury villas and estate properties scattered just outside the Rome city limits. These secluded compounds served as private entertainment hubs catering to elite foreign diplomats, influential corporate figures, and compromised high-ranking prelates. Because these estates were protected entirely by the Holy See's absolute diplomatic sovereignty, the Italian state police were legally barred from crossing the threshold. No warrants could be served, no surveillance could be legally authorized. It was a perfect, self-contained ghost network where human lives were traded as currency, completely insulated from the rule of law. The ghost networks of Rome remain hidden in the dark. But the deeper you dig into the ancient vaults, the more you realize that the Holy See was never just a church. It was the ultimate, untouchable global empire. The gold-leafed altars of the Vatican were built to reflect the divine, but the shadows stretching across its history reveal a far more sinister reality. The Holy See has operated as the ultimate sovereign vault. It is a fortress protected not just by stone but by absolute diplomatic immunity, a legal vacuum where accountability ceases to exist. The terrifying truth isn't that these dark secrets are anomalies, it's that they are woven directly into the fabric of the institution itself. And as the iron gates lock shut and the static fades, you are left to wonder just how many more horrors remain buried where the world is legally forbidden to look.